In the spring of 1929, a German archaeological team from the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft, excavating the ancient mound of Vaka in southern Iraq, broke through a layer of compacted ash and silt at a depth of nearly 4 meters and found themselves looking at something that should not have existed. Pressed into fragments of baked clay and preserved with extraordinary clarity were rows of systematic symbols, not scratches, not tally marks, not primitive pictograms in the early stages of becoming something, but a fully developed notational vocabulary containing over 900 distinct signs, arranged according to grammar, organized by category, and deployed with the confidence of a scribal tradition that had been operating for generations. The site was Uruk, the city the ancient Sumerians regarded as the first great urban center of the world. The layer they had reached, designated Uruk IV by the excavation stratigraphy, dated to approximately 3,200 years before the Common Era. What they had found was the earliest recoverable writing in human history. The tablets, now catalogued as the Uruk IV series and housed primarily in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, have been cited in every standard account of writing's origins for nearly a century. The conventional narrative is familiar. Writing emerged from the administrative demands of a growing temple economy, beginning with pictographic notations of commodities and quantities, and gradually becoming more abstract until recognizable cuneiform script emerged. It is a tidy story. It also fails to account for a specific detail that sits at the center of the Uruk IV record and has been quietly sidestepped by mainstream scholarship ever since. Among the commodity lists and offering tallies, pressed into the same clay, appearing with a frequency that dwarfs every other symbol in the archive, is the AN sign, an 8-pointed star enclosed within a circle. It is the Sumerian sign for heaven, sky, and divine being. It is not an administrative marker. It does not denote grain or livestock. It marks the presence of something the ancient scribes considered neither mundane nor local, and in the oldest recoverable layer of human writing it appears first. The evidence examined in this investigation spans multiple continents and thousands of years, drawing on cuneiform tablet archives, Egyptian hieroglyphic inscription chambers, Indus Valley script parallels, sealed underground repositories, and the testimony of ancient scribes who did not record that they were inventing a system of writing, but that they were transcribing one that had been delivered to them by beings who descended from the sky. If this investigation challenges what you believed about the moment humanity first put language into permanent form, consider subscribing to follow this inquiry as it continues. The principle that governs the archaeology of every complex human invention is developmental gradualism. The idea that sophisticated technologies and symbolic systems leave behind traceable sequences of precursor stages. Pottery shows it, metallurgy shows it, architecture shows it. Every major human achievement that archaeology has examined in sufficient depth reveals a stratigraphic ladder of increasing complexity, with crude early forms giving way to refined successors across identifiable cultural periods. It is the fundamental assumption underlying every timeline of ancient civilizational development. It is also the assumption that the Werke excavations of the 1920s and 30s quietly demolished, without anyone in mainstream archaeology fully acknowledging what the evidence actually implied. When Julius Jordan and his Deutsche Orientgesellschaft team reached the Uruk IV stratum at the ancient site, they did not find proto-writing struggling toward coherence. They found a complete system. The implications of that completeness has been insufficiently examined for nearly a century, and the reason begins with what was sitting in that layer alongside the commodity tallies. Julius Jordan had begun excavating at Warka in southern Iraq the biblical Erech, the Sumerian Uruk, in 1912 under the auspices of the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft. The site had long been known to local inhabitants as a source of ancient bricks, and preliminary surveys had revealed the outlines of what was clearly a major ancient urban centre. But it was not until the intensive excavation seasons of 1928 through 1935, with a larger team and a more systematic stratigraphic methodology, that Jordan and his successor Heinrich Lentzen reached the deeper occupation levels that would transform the understanding of early civilization. At a depth of approximately 4 meters below the surface of the ancient mound, working through successive layers of compacted debris, ash, and eroded mud brick, the team encountered a transitional stratum that geologists and archaeologists designated the Uruk IV phase. What emerged from that stratum was not what developmental models predicted. Standard developmental models for the emergence of writing predict a recognizable sequence. Researchers expect to find notched tallies first, followed by token systems representing specific commodities, followed by pictographic marks that gradually become more stylized, followed eventually by a true writing system capable of expressing abstract relationships and grammatical structures. This sequence has been partially documented at various Mesopotamian sites in later periods, which has reinforced confidence in the model. But the Uruk IV stratum does not display this sequence. It presents, at its very earliest recoverable level, a notational system already capable of expressing commodity categories, quantities, institutional recipients, personal designations, and, critically, non-economic conceptual categories for which no administrative purpose has been satisfactorily demonstrated. The system did not arrive as a primitive notation struggling to become writing. It arrived as writing. The tablets themselves provide the most direct evidence of this anomaly. The Uruk corpus, spanning both the Uruk IV and Uruk III phases, has been systematically catalogued since the 1960s through an international collaborative effort based primarily in Berlin, with major collections also held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, the British Museum in London, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. Robert Englund of the Free University of Berlin, who produced the definitive analytical study of the Uruk texts in the 1990s, noted explicitly that the earliest recoverable tablets from the Uruk IV phase show no internal evidence of a prior developmental stage. The sign forms are confident. The compositional grammar is consistent. The institutional vocabulary is in place. There is no archaeological horizon visible beneath the Uruk IV layer at which writing can be observed in the process of being invented. England's colleague Hans Niesen, whose foundational 1986 study of the origins of writing in the Near East established the comparative framework that Assyriology still uses today, identified the same problem from a different angle. Niesen examined the spatial distribution of the Uruk IV tablets across the excavated site and found that they were concentrated in the precinct of the Eanna temple complex, not scattered across residential or market areas as one would expect from a system invented for general commercial use. The earliest writing in human history was a temple institution from its first recoverable moment. It was organized around the administration of a sacred precinct, produced by specialists whose training was managed by the temple hierarchy, and stored in depositories that served the temple archive rather than the broader civic economy. Whatever drove its creation, the first impulse was not mercantile convenience. It was institutional, and the institution in question was dedicated to the administration of the divine. This is the detail that the standard account consistently downplays in favor of the grain and livestock narrative, and it becomes considerably more significant when one examines not merely where the tablets were found, but what the very first entries in those tablets actually record. When scholars determined that the Uruk IV tablet archive contained over 900 distinct signs, the response within mainstream Assyriology was to fit this number into the existing administrative origin theory by arguing that early pictographic systems are inherently redundant and contextually variable, and that the sign count would naturally decrease as writing became more standardized. This is precisely what happened. By the later Uruk III period, the sign inventory had contracted significantly, and by the early dynastic era, it had been streamlined further still. Conventional scholarship presents this contraction as evidence of the system maturing, but this interpretation inverts the developmental logic it claims to follow. A writing system invented to record grain deliveries does not begin with 900 symbols. A writing system inherited from an existing tradition of vastly broader scope, and then gradually narrowed to administrative use does. The distinction matters enormously, and tablet cataloguing evidence from Berlin, Philadelphia, and Oxford makes the case with a precision that the administrative origin model has never successfully answered. The specific number 920 is the figure most commonly cited in specialist literature for the Uruk IV sign inventory, though individual analyses have produced counts ranging from 870 to over 1,000. Depending on methodological choices about variant forms and contextual allographs, different graphic realizations of the same underlying sign. Even at the conservative lower estimate, this is an extraordinary vocabulary for a system supposedly at its earliest stage. For comparison, the earliest recoverable Greek alphabetic inscriptions contain 24 signs. The proto-Sinaitic script, from which most Western alphabets ultimately derive, contains approximately 30 signs. The cuneiform system that emerged from the Uruk IV tradition eventually stabilized in its old Babylonian form at approximately 600 signs for full literary use and a working administrative subset of around 300. The trend throughout its development moved consistently downward in sign count. The earliest phase, the phase that developmental theory predicts should be the simplest, has more signs than any subsequent phase. This is not a system that starts simple and grows complex. It is a system that starts maximally complex and is progressively simplified. Assyriologist Christopher Woods of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago addressed this problem directly in his 2010 essay on early Mesopotamian signs and scribal culture, published in the Oriental Institute's annual research report. Woods noted that the 900-plus sign inventory of the Uruk IV corpus is functionally far larger than anything required for the administrative tasks that the tablets demonstrably perform. The economic records of the Uruk IV archive, the grain distributions, livestock tallies, and ration assignments that constitute the majority of the recovered tablets use a working vocabulary of approximately 150 to 200 signs in regular combination. The remaining 700 or more signs in the inventory appear in the corpus at much lower frequencies, concentrated in specific tablet types, and often in contexts that do not correspond to any identifiable administrative function. Woods described this residual vocabulary as one whose original semantic domain cannot be recovered from the administrative context in which it appears. What it means, stripped of its diplomatic scholarly phrasing, is that roughly 3/4 of the earliest human writing system was doing something other than recording grain. The lexical list tradition preserved the evidence of this broader semantic domain in a form that has survived across millennia, though its implications have been systematically underappreciated. The lexical lists, standardized training text that enumerates signs and sign combinations in canonical sequences, were among the earliest compositions copied by scribal students, and among the most persistently maintained throughout Mesopotamian scribal history. Nick Veldhuis of the University of California, Berkeley, whose detailed analysis of the lexical tradition published in 2014 is the definitive study of this material, demonstrated that the organizational logic of these lists encodes a hierarchical taxonomy of the Sumerian world view. The lists do not begin with economic categories, they begin with the divine. The first and longest section of the canonical lexical series, known as Hura, equals Hubulu, which Veldhuis traces back to Uruk IV precursor lists, enumerates the names and attributes of divine beings before proceeding to the heavens, then the earth, then human institutions, then finally the commodities and economic categories that mainstream theory identifies as writing's primary purpose. The system was organized from the top down. Heaven came before grain, and the divine came before the administrative, because that is the order in which the tradition that produced the system had arranged the world. The sign contraction between Uruk IV and the early dynastic period, re-examined in this light, looks less like a system maturing and more like a system being deliberately narrowed. The signs that were dropped were not random redundancies. They were, in disproportionate number, signs from the upper registers of the lexical hierarchy, the divine and celestial categories that appear at the top of the lists but have limited use in daily economic administration. What survived into the streamlined later tradition was the administrative subset of a sign system whose full scope encompassed far more than administration. And what that broader scope was originally designed to record, the pattern of a specific recurring symbol, makes considerably clearer. Tablet W 20030, catalogued in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin and dated to the Uruk IV phase, contains what paleographer Margaret Green identified in 1984 as one of the earliest recoverable uses of the N sign in a non-administrative context. The sign appears not as a modifier attached to a commodity name but as a standalone entry, pressed into the clay with the same deliberate pressure used for the primary record entries surrounding it. Green's analysis, published in the journal Zeitschrift für Assyriologie, noted the anomaly and moved past it. But the frequency data she compiled is extraordinary. Across the Uruk IV corpus, the AN sign appears in association with the very earliest identifiable entries at a rate that exceeds every commodity marker including grain, which conventional theory positions as the primary driver of writing's invention. Whatever the scribes of Uruk were most urgently committed to recording in those first moments of written history, it was not a shipment of barley. It was the presence, authority, and categorical designation of something they marked with the sign for divine heavenly being. The N sign itself is visually straightforward, a star form with 8 radiating points, sometimes enclosed within a circular boundary, sometimes appearing without it. In the later cuneiform tradition, it develops into a conventionalized 3-stroke cluster used as the Dingjia determinative, the god marker that prefixes divine names, but its graphic origin in the Uruk IV corpus is unmistakably pictographic, representing a stellar body of some kind. The Sumerian word An means sky, heaven, and the celestial realm simultaneously, and the sign carries all 3 meanings in its earliest uses. It is also the name of the supreme deity of the Sumerian pantheon, the sky god Anu, whose name is simply the word for sky made into a proper designation for the being that inhabits and embodies it. The sign, The word, the deity, and the concept are unified in a single graphic form that is simultaneously a star, a name, and a cosmological category. What makes Green's frequency data so significant is not merely the rate of the sign's appearance, but its distributional pattern within the corpus. In the Uruk IV tablets, signs cluster according to the semantic domain of the tablet they appear on. Economic tablets show dense clustering of commodity markers and numerical notations. What would be expected if the AN sign were primarily a grammatical modifier is that it should appear broadly distributed across all tablet types, attached to various designations as a qualifying prefix. What Green's data shows instead is that the N sign concentrates in specific tablet types and specific positions within those tablets. Leading positions, the locations where a notation system places its most important categorical designation. It appears first, and most often, in tablets whose other content resists classification as economic administration. This distributional pattern is the signature of a primary categorical term, not a grammatical modifier. The N sign was not decorating the edges of the administrative system. It was anchoring a category of record that sat alongside, and by frequency measurement ahead of, the economic records that conventional theory identifies as the system's reason for being. Assyriologist Gebhard Sells of the University of Vienna, whose research into the divine categories of early Sumerian institutional organization has produced the most detailed examination of the AN sign's early uses, published a study in 2012 in the journal Altorientalische Forschungen that traced the sign's semantic range across the Uruk IV corpus and the subsequent early dynastic texts. Selds identified that in the earlier strata, the Ian designation appears in connection with a cluster of associated signs that describe physical movement between elevated and ground-level locations, the management of light-emitting or thermally significant objects, and the allocation of resources to recipients whose designations are non-human. This cluster does not map onto any known category of Sumerian religious myth or cultic practice as conventionally understood. It maps instead onto what Sells carefully describes as a record of institutional transactions involving entities whose operational domain was celestial. The frequency pattern, the positional priority, and the distributional clustering of the Aeon sign collectively suggest that the scribes who pressed these marks into clay were not incidentally noting the divine alongside the practical. They were primarily noting the divine, and the administrative records of grain and livestock were the secondary layer added to a system whose principal purpose was the documentation of celestial institutional activity. If that reading of the evidence is correct, and the data Green and Sells compiled supports it, then the first writing in human history was not a business ledger. It was something closer to an administrative record of operations conducted by or on behalf of beings designated with the sign for sky. The question of who those beings were and what kind of system existed before the signs were first pressed into Uruk clay receives its most challenging formulation not from the Uruk archive itself, but from an earlier artifact recovered from a different city entirely. The limestone tablet discovered at the site of Tel al-Haymir in Iraq, identified as ancient Kish and now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford under catalogue reference AN 1923.444, presents a chronological challenge that complicates the standard Uruk origin narrative in ways that have not been resolved. The tablet, dated through thermoluminescence analysis and stratigraphic context to approximately 3,500 years before the Common Era, predates the earliest Uruk IV writing by up to 3 centuries. Its incised surface contains proto-cuneiform symbols, including representations of a human head, a hand, a foot, and geometric notations whose precise meaning remains contested. What has not been contested, and what has received almost no attention in popular accounts, is the symbol that appears in the upper register of the tablet's obverse face, carved with greater depth and deliberateness than any of the surrounding pictograms. It is a circular enclosure bisected by radiating lines, a form functionally equivalent to the AN sign of the later Uruk corpus. The Kish tablet may not merely predate the standard account of writing's first appearance. It may indicate that the symbol for divine heavenly presence was the first symbol of all. The Kish tablet was recovered during excavations conducted at Tel al-Uhaymir in 1923 by an expedition jointly sponsored by Oxford University and the Chicago Field Museum, operating under the direction of Stephen Langdon. Langdon, who held the chair of Assyriology at Oxford and was among the most influential Mesopotamian scholars of his generation, recognized the tablet immediately as an object of exceptional importance. Its limestone material was unusual. The vast majority of Mesopotamian writing was pressed into clay, and limestone incising represents a different and considerably more labor-intensive technique that implies deliberate selection of a durable medium over the convenient one. Someone chose to commit these particular marks to stone rather than to the disposable clay of everyday administrative practice. The choice of material alone signals that whatever was being recorded was intended to survive. The tablet's dimensions are modest, approximately 11 centimeters in length and 8 centimeters in width, but its sign inventory is sophisticated. Langdon's initial analysis, published in the Oxford Journal of the Philosophical Society in 1925, identified the signs as proto-cuneiform and noted their resemblance to the Uruk IV corpus. The subsequent debate about the tablet's precise date has been ongoing for the better part of a century, with some scholars arguing for a date contemporary with the Uruk IV material and others using stratigraphic and thermoluminescence evidence, placing it as much as 3 centuries earlier. The current consensus, most recently articulated by Irving Finkel of the British Museum in a 2015 reassessment of the Kish material, places the tablet in the period immediately preceding the Uruk IV horizon, making it, on the current evidence, the oldest writing yet recovered. The symbols on its face have received repeated analysis without definitive consensus on their reading. The human head, hand, and foot are recognizable as pictographic precursors of later cuneiform signs for body parts. The geometric notations, rows of parallel lines and a set of circular marks, may represent numerical values, though the counting system that would decode them remains unclear. What has not been debated is the presence and primacy of the uppermost symbol, the circular form with internal radiating lines that occupies the position in the upper left register of the obverse face, the location that scribal convention throughout the Mesopotamian tradition reserves for the most important categorical designation of the record. This is the position where, in later administrative tablets, the recipient institution or the authorizing authority appears. On the Kish tablet, the oldest writing surface yet recovered, that position is occupied by a star-form symbol. John Chadwick, better known for his pivotal role in deciphering Linear B, examined photographs of the Kish tablet in the 1960s and noted in a brief published comment that the uppermost symbol bore a structural resemblance to what he called the divine identifier, found in the later Mesopotamian tradition. He considered this a minor notational curiosity and did not pursue it. Subsequent researchers have similarly noted the parallels and moved past them. But the parallel is not minor. If the oldest recoverable inscription in human history begins with the symbol that the subsequent 3,000-year writing tradition of Mesopotamia consistently used to designate divine celestial beings, the most parsimonious explanation is not coincidence, it is continuity. The Kish tablet also raises a geographical point that the Uruk origin narrative consistently elides. Kish was not Uruk. The two cities were separated by approximately 200 kilometers, occupied different ecological zones within southern Mesopotamia, and had distinct institutional and administrative traditions. The presence of a sophisticated, already formed notational system at Kish at a period equal to or earlier than its presence at Uruk implies that writing did not originate in a single administrative centre and spread outward. It implies that both cities were working from a shared tradition, a common ancestral system of notation that predated both of them. The Sumerian scribes who later wrote about where their scribal art came from were consistent on this point. They did not say it came from Uruk. They said it came from the sky, and they preserved in their most carefully maintained literary compositions a detailed account of that transmission, one whose specific claims have never been adequately reckoned with by mainstream scholarship. Among the most significant cuneiform compositions preserved from the early Sumerian period are a cluster of texts collectively referred to by scholars as the Me lists, catalogues of the divine decrees that governed every aspect of civilized existence. These texts, found in multiple versions at Nippur, Ur and Eridu, enumerate the Me as a comprehensive inventory of cultural and institutional technologies. Kingship, priesthood, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the scribal arts, mathematics, the craft of the smith, the knowledge of music, truth, descent of the endship, and dozens more. The significance of the Me tablets for understanding the origin of writing lies not in their content alone, but in the scribal tradition that produced them. These texts claim explicitly that the Me were not human inventions. They were divine properties held by the god Enki at his temple complex in Eridu, distributed to the cities of Sumer during the foundational period of civilization. When the Sumerian scribes first pressed the symbols for writing and mathematics into clay, they were, according to their own account, recording technologies that had been handed down from a non-human source. The Me tablets are the written record of a transmission. Samuel Noah Kramer, who translated the primary version of the Me list from tablets held in the University Museum in Philadelphia and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, published his foundational analysis in 1944 in his landmark synthesis of Sumerian mythology. Kramer's catalogue of the Me enumerated over 100 discrete items that the Sumerian tradition considered divine decrees, not merely practices or customs, but ontological properties of civilized existence that had been delivered to humanity from the divine realm. The list includes the scribal arts explicitly, designated in the tablets by a compound Sumerian phrase meaning the craft of the scribe, which is listed alongside the purification of the divine powers and the descent of the gods as a technology of equivalent standing and divine origin. Writing, in the Sumerian understanding of their own history, was not something they invented. It was something they received. The Me list itself is preserved in its most complete form in the composition known as Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization from Eridu to Erech. This text, recovered in multiple fragmentary copies that together allow a fairly complete reconstruction, narrates the journey of the goddess Inanna from her city of Uruk to the primordial city of Eridu, the seat of the god Enki, in order to obtain the Me for her city. The text describes Enki's banquet hall where the divine decrees are stored, Inanna's successful acquisition of all 104 Me, and her return journey to Uruk where the properties are installed and the city becomes the center of civilized life. The narrative is framed as myth, but its functional content is administrative, a transfer of institutional technologies from one divine center to another, documented with the specificity of a treaty rather than the imagery of a legend. The specific language used for the ME throughout the Sumerian texts has been the subject of sustained philological analysis. Ocker Sjöberg of the University of Pennsylvania, who spent decades refining the reading of the ME concept in his work on the Sumerian lexicon published through the Philadelphia-based Sumerian Dictionary Project, identified that the term MEE in its root semantic range connotes neither law nor custom in the sense that later classical traditions use those terms. The me is better translated as a functional operational principle, a property that makes a thing what it is, that enables its proper operation. The me of writing is not the rule that writing exists. It is the active principle that makes writing function as writing. This is a subtle but critical distinction. It means that when the Sumerian texts say the me of the scribal arts were held by Enki and delivered to human civilization, they are saying that the operational capacity for writing, the ability to make marks that function as language, was transmitted from a divine source to human practitioners. The ME tablets do not claim that humans developed writing. They claim that writing was installed. Kramer's treatment of these texts as mythology has been followed by virtually every subsequent mainstream scholar, and the literary designation is not without justification. But the literary form of the ME text should not obscure their historical claims, which are specific, consistent across multiple independent copies, recovered from different cities, and embedded within a broader scribal tradition that repeatedly and without ambiguity attributes the foundational technologies of Sumerian civilization to non-human sources. The Aduba curriculum that trained Sumerian scribes began, as Veldhuis's analysis of the lexical lists has documented, with the names and attributes of the beings who the tradition said delivered writing to humanity. The scribes who pressed the first marks into Uruk clay were, according to the records they themselves produced, not inventors but recipients, students of a system that had been given to them by something they marked at the very top of their oldest tablets with the sign for the divine inhabitant of the sky. The identity of those beings, and the precise mechanism by which the transfer they claimed occurred, is encoded in a set of texts that the Sumerian tradition preserved as carefully as any document it ever produced, and decoded through a set of symbols whose deliberate removal from the official archive remains, even now, the most revealing editorial act in the entire history of human writing. The cuneiform texts known as the Abgal traditions, preserved in copies from the Old Babylonian period, but drawing on materials demonstrably older, identify 7 specific figures credited with establishing the foundations of Sumerian civilization before and immediately after the Great Flood. These figures, designated Abgal in Sumerian and Apkallu in Akkadian, were not human scholars. The text described them as beings who came from the sea, who taught the black-headed people the arts of agriculture, metallurgy, astronomical observation, and crucially, writing. The third Abgal, designated Emmeduga in the King List tradition, is specifically credited in the tablet series known as the 7 Sages, with establishing the proper forms of the scribal arts and organizing the curriculum of the temple schools. Tablet CBS 11672 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection, part of the Nippur archive, excavated between 1888 and 1900 by the University of Pennsylvania expedition, contains a passage in archaic Sumerian that describes Emmeduga as one who set the signs in their correct positions and established the count of the heavenly markings. The first teachers of writing, according to the people who invented writing, were not human. The 7 Abgal are named consistently across multiple independent Mesopotamian sources, spanning more than a millennium of textual transmission. The Babylonian priest and historian Berossus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century before the Common Era and drawing on cuneiform temple archives, to which he had direct access as a serving priest of Marduk at Babylon, describes the first and greatest of the Abgal, whom he renders in Greek as Owans, in terms that are among the most extraordinary in ancient historical literature. Berossus records that Owanes appeared from the sea during the first year of human civilization, and spent each day among human beings without eating, teaching them the use of letters, sciences and arts of all kinds, the building of cities, the founding of temples, the compilation of laws, and the principles of geometry. At sunset he returned to the sea. Berossus is explicit that this teaching was complete. Nothing of significance has been added since by way of improvement. The Abgal, according to the most detailed ancient account of their activities, delivered a finished body of knowledge, including writing, from which human civilization did not subsequently deviate in its foundations. The 7 Abgal listed in the canonical Sumerian tradition and the Akkadian texts derived from it are Wana, Wanaduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, and Utwabzu. Each is associated in the textual tradition with a specific pre-flood king whose reign they served as counselor, and each is credited with specific domains of knowledge transmission. Wana, the first and equivalent to the Owans of Berossus, is credited broadly with establishing civilization's foundations. Wanaduga is associated with the codification of celestial omens and the establishment of observation protocols for tracking planetary movements. Enmegalama and Enmebeluga are credited in different sources with metallurgy and hydraulic engineering respectively. Anenlilda, the 6th Abgal, is specifically described in the tablet series examined by Assyriologist Wilfrid Lambert of the University of Birmingham in his foundational 1967 study of Babylonian wisdom literature as the one who established the proper sequence of signs, the canonical ordering of the cuneiform sign list that Adupa students were required to memorize as the foundation of their scribal training. Lambert's analysis, published in the journal Iraq, identified that the Abgal tradition is not a late mythological construction imposed on earlier history by Babylonian religious imagination. It draws on administrative and literary source material traceable to the Ur III period at the latest and almost certainly to earlier phases of Sumerian scribal culture. The tablet evidence from Nippur shows that the curriculum of the earlier scribal schools included specific compositions about the Abgal as foundational material, not as mythology appended to practical training, but as the stated historical context within which the purpose and authority of the scribal system were understood. Scribes were not taught to write, and then given accounts of divine origins to explain their craft. They were taught the divine origins of their craft as the necessary prerequisite to understanding what they were doing when they wrote. The physical description of the Abgal that recurs across multiple source texts, beings who came from the water, who could pass between sea and land, who possessed knowledge far beyond human capacity, has generated considerable modern scholarly discomfort, handled predominantly through the interpretive move of classifying the descriptions as mythological metaphor. But the Mesopotamian texts do not deploy the Abgal descriptions in the register of metaphor. They appear in the same administrative and chronicle register used to record the reigns of human kings, the construction of buildings, and the movement of trade goods. The ancient scribes who preserved these accounts were not writing poetry. They were writing institutional memory, and the institution they were documenting was one founded by beings who came from somewhere other than where human civilization began, taught the scribal arts among other foundational technologies, and then withdrew, leaving behind in the clay of the Uruk archive the marks they had established as the proper signs for recording the world. The numbers embedded in the oldest levels of that archive carry the same implication in a different register entirely. A detail in the Uruk IV tablet corpus that has generated sustained specialist debate without reaching general academic consciousness is the presence of systematic numerical sequences that do not correspond to any known commodity inventory or administrative function. Assyriologist Robert Englund of the Free University of Berlin identified a cluster of tablets in the late 1980s, designated in the corpus as the W21000 series, whose numerical entries follow patterns consistent with astronomical observation records rather than economic documentation. The sequences correspond with remarkable precision to the synodic periods of Venus, the lunar month count, and the base 60 positional notation system the Sumerians used for astronomical calculation. These tablets were found in the same depositional context as unambiguous administrative records, pressed with the same stylus techniques, and dated to the same stratigraphic horizon. If writing was invented for commerce, the presence of astronomical calculation sequences in the inaugural archive requires an explanation that the administrative origin theory has not provided. England's analysis suggested the sequences might represent a shared notational infrastructure underlying both economic and astronomical documentation, which implies the system was designed from the beginning to serve both purposes simultaneously. The synodic period of Venus, the full cycle between successive superior conjunctions of Venus relative to Earth as observed from the ground, requires careful, sustained, multi-generational record-keeping to establish with precision. Babylonian astronomers would eventually track this cycle in records of approximately 584 days per complete synodic return, a figure refined over centuries of systematic observation. The W21000 series tablets do not label their numerical entries with commodity signs identifying grain or livestock. They record sequences of numbers in columnar arrangements that suggest iterative calculation rather than inventory listing. In an inventory tablet, numbers appear once for each commodity being recorded. In these tablets, the same numerical values appear in repeating series, with incremental adjustments that match the computational patterns of astronomical ephemeris tables. The calculation grids that track celestial body positions across successive time intervals. The presence of this kind of iterative astronomical calculation in the founding stratum of human writing is not an administrative feature. It is evidence of a parallel purpose built into the system from its inception. The lunar month count presents an even more striking anomaly. The Sumerian base 60 number system produces a particularly elegant relationship with the lunar cycle. 29.5 days per lunar month multiplied by the 12-month Sumerian year yields 354 days, a figure that relates to the solar year of 365.25 days through ratios expressible as simple fractions in base 60. The adjustment calculations required to reconcile lunar and solar years, the intercalation protocols that prevent calendar drift, appear in the W21000 series in a form that, as Englund noted in his 1992 analysis published in the series Cuneiform Monographs, is functionally identical to the calculation methods documented in the much later Old Babylonian astronomical texts. The mathematical approach to the lunisolar calendar problem was the same in the oldest recoverable layer of writing as it would be 2,000 years later in the formalized Babylonian astronomical tradition. This is not developmental progression. It is transmission of a fixed method across an extended period without modification. The implications of the base 60 number system itself have been insufficiently examined in popular accounts of Mesopotamian civilization. Human beings, working from the most anatomically immediate reference points available, fingers, would naturally tend toward base 10 or base 20. The practical divisibility advantages of 60, while real, are not self-evident to anyone who has not already been working with large number sets, where divisibility by multiple factors matters. Historian of mathematics Otto Neugebauer, whose foundational work on Babylonian mathematics published in 1955 established the field as a serious academic discipline, noted this paradox explicitly. He observed that the base 60 system presupposes a level of mathematical sophistication that makes its spontaneous emergence from a primitive commercial notation system highly implausible. The system is too refined, too mathematically capable, to have begun as a tally system invented for grain distribution. Neugebauer's assessment, reinforced by subsequent analysis, points toward a system that was designed, or inherited, rather than evolved. The astronomical sequences in the Uruk IV archive support this interpretation by demonstrating that the base 60 system was being used for astronomical calculation from the moment writing first appears. If the system was designed for astronomical purposes and then applied secondarily to commerce, the presence of astronomical data in the founding archive is exactly what one would expect. If the system was invented for commerce and only later applied to astronomy, the astronomical sequences in the founding archive require an explanation that the administrative origin theory has never provided. The identity of who designed the system, and for what original purpose, connects directly to the grammar of the scribal system itself, specifically to a feature of that grammar that conventional accounts present as a late refinement, but that the earliest evidence reveals was present from the very beginning. The Dingir sign, a cuneiform determinative used throughout the Mesopotamian scribal tradition to mark the names of divine beings, is conventionally presented as a grammatical feature that developed organically within the cuneiform system as it matured from pictographic origins. It appears as a stylized star form, closely related to the AN sign, but used specifically as a categorical prefix that identifies whatever follows it as a deity or divine entity. The problem with the conventional developmental account is temporal. Cuneiform determinatives are typically late developing features of a writing system, grammatical refinements that appear after the basic notational vocabulary has been established and the system has been in use long enough to require disambiguation tools. The Dingir determinative, however, appears in the Uruk IV stratum in uses that suggest it was not a refinement but a foundational feature. Philologist Nick Veldhuis of the University of California, Berkeley, documented in his 2014 analysis of the lexical text tradition that the divine determinative appears in the earliest recoverable lexical lists, which are the training texts used to teach scribes, at a position of categorical primacy before commodity terms, before personal names, and before any administrative vocabulary. The scribal system was organized from its foundation around the identification of divine beings. The concept of a determinative in ancient writing systems is technical and merits precise explanation in the context of this evidence. A determinative is a sign used not to express a phonetic value or a specific word, but to indicate the semantic category of the word it accompanies. In Egyptian hieroglyphics, a sign depicting a papyrus roll is placed after words related to writing and abstract concepts. A sign depicting a sitting man is placed after male personal names. These categorical markers help readers distinguish between words that might otherwise be ambiguous in a large sign system, and they emerge in writing traditions as organizational tools once the system has been in use long enough for ambiguity to become a practical problem requiring systematic solution. They are by their nature secondary features, responses to the complexity that arises when a notational system has grown large enough to require disambiguation infrastructure. They should not appear in the founding stratum of a writing system that is supposedly being invented from nothing. The Dinga sign's presence in the Uruk IV stratum as a functional categorical determinative is therefore precisely the kind of anomaly that the developmental account cannot accommodate without significant modification. Veldhuis's analysis documents not merely that the sign appears early, but that its earliest uses are systematically grammatical rather than pictographic. In the pictographic phase of any writing system's development, signs are used for their direct representational value. A picture of a head means head, a picture of a grain stalk means grain. The Dingir sign in its earliest documented uses is not depicting a star for the purpose of recording something about stars. It is functioning as a categorical prefix, marking the entries that follow it as belonging to the class of divine beings. This is a grammatical use, not a pictographic one, and grammatical uses of signs presuppose a system that has already established the sign's categorical function through prior convention. The convention was already in place before the earliest tablets were pressed. Assyriologist Daniel Snell of the University of Oklahoma, who examined the taxonomy embedded in the lexical list tradition in a series of studies published between 1997 and 2006, identified that the lexical lists, particularly the early ancestor lists recovered in Uruk IV contexts, organize signs into a hierarchical categorical scheme that places the Dingir marked divine category at the apex of the entire system. The scheme works downward from the divine through the celestial, through the terrestrial, through human institutions, through natural phenomena, and finally to the economic categories that mainstream theory treats as writing's primary purpose. Snell notes that this organizational logic is not administrative, it is cosmological. The scribes who established the canonical order of the sign list were not organizing their system around the practical needs of the temple economy. They were organizing it around a complete worldview in which the divine occupied the top of every hierarchy of significance, a worldview that was already fully formed when the system began, a scribal tradition that establishes, from its very first recoverable moment, a comprehensive cosmological taxonomy with divine categories at its apex, and that deploys sophisticated grammatical features requiring an established prior convention, is a tradition that did not begin with the tablets currently recognized as its oldest examples. The Dingir determinative in the Uruk IV stratum is not the beginning of a scribal convention, it is the continuation of one, and the question of where that convention began, what system or tradition established the categorical primacy of divine beings in human notation before the Uruk IV scribes first pressed clay, leads directly to the most profound anomaly in the entire study of ancient language, the problem that has confronted every linguist who has tried to trace the origins of the tongue in which all of these marks were made. Every major language family on Earth has been traced, through systematic comparative linguistics, to ancestor tongues that connect it to neighbouring families through shared phonological patterns, grammatical structures, and core vocabulary items. The Indo-European family connects Sanskrit to Latin to Greek to Persian through identifiable protoforms. The Semitic family connects Akkadian to Hebrew to Arabic through demonstrable ancestral structures. Sumerian connects to nothing. Despite over a century of intensive scholarly effort involving every major linguistics institution in the world, no ancestral language, no cousin language, and no daughter language has been identified for Sumerian. It stands in the linguistic record as what specialists call a language isolate, a tongue that appeared in the historical record without discernible evolutionary relationship to any other human language. For the administrative origin theory of writing, this is an awkward circumstance. A writing system invented by a human community to manage local economic needs should reflect the linguistic community that invented it, and that community should be traceable through the standard mechanisms of population movement and cultural contact. Sumerian's complete isolation in the world language record suggests either an origin so ancient that all comparative evidence has been lost, or an origin that conventional population models do not account for. The methods of comparative linguistics are robust and have proven reliable across hundreds of language families by systematically comparing core vocabulary items, terms for numbers, body parts, basic natural phenomena, kinship relationships. Linguists identify cognate words sharing common ancestors, reconstruct proto-languages that have left no written record, and trace the movements and relationships of human populations across millennia. The reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, the ancestral tongue of the language family that includes English, German, Hindi, Russian, Greek, and Latin, has been one of the major achievements of modern linguistics. Its basic vocabulary, grammatical structure, and phonological system have been recovered with substantial confidence, even though no text written in it has ever been found. The power of the comparative method is such that it works even without documentary evidence. Phonological patterns and core vocabulary correspondences leave enough residue in daughter languages to permit reconstruction of the parent. Sumerian leaves no such residue in any documented language. Linguist Gonzalo Rubio of Pennsylvania State University, whose comprehensive survey of proposed Sumerian linguistic connections, published in 2001, represents the most thorough modern assessment of the problem, examined every serious proposal for Sumerian external genetic relationships produced since the 19th century. These proposals have connected Sumerian to Dravidian, to Tibeto-Burman, to the Austronesian family, to various African language groups, to Basque, and to a range of other isolates and proposed proto-language systems. Rubio's assessment of each proposal is consistent. The proposed correspondences do not survive rigorous comparative methodology. The phonological matches are not systematic. The grammatical parallels are typological rather than genetic. The vocabulary correspondences are too few and too scattered to demonstrate common descent. None of the proposals, he concluded, rises above the threshold of chance resemblance. Sumerian is genuinely isolated in a way that no other well-documented ancient language is. The grammatical structure of Sumerian compounds the isolation problem by being unlike any neighbouring language in its fundamental architecture. Sumerian is an ergative absolutive language with a glutinative morphology, meaning it marks the subject of a transitive verb differently from the subject of an intransitive verb, and it builds complex words by stringing together sequences of morphological elements in chains. The neighbouring Semitic languages of Akkadian and Babylonian, which eventually absorbed Sumerian as a sacred literary and ceremonial language when it ceased to be spoken colloquially around 2,000 years before the Common Era, are nominative accusative languages with root and pattern morphology that differs entirely in structural organization. This degree of divergence is not what one expects between languages that emerged in close geographical proximity through normal processes of drift from common ancestors. It is what one would expect from a language that did not emerge from the surrounding population at all. The Sumerian scribes themselves recorded a consistent account of where their language's foundational properties came from, the scribble arts, held by Enki and delivered to human civilization at Eridu. The linguistic isolation of Sumerian in the modern scholarly record is not merely an academic puzzle. It is the material signature of exactly the kind of origin that the Sumerian texts themselves describe, and the records of what disappeared from that system in its first identifiable transition, what the scribes of the succeeding generation chose to remove from the archive their predecessors had built, constitute the most direct evidence available that the system's full scope was deliberately curtailed within living memory of its establishment. Between the Uruk IV stratum and the immediately succeeding Uruk III phase, the cuneiform sign inventory contracted by an estimated 40%. Assyriologists have consistently framed this reduction as progressive refinement, the system shedding redundant pictographic variants as it became more efficient. This explanation is not unreasonable as far as it goes, but it fails to account for which signs were eliminated. A study conducted by Hans Nissen of the Free University of Berlin in his landmark analysis of the Uruk texts published in 1986 identified that a disproportionate number of the eliminated signs belonged to a specific semantic category: signs associated with celestial phenomena, divine attributes, and non-administrative designations of status and authority. The signs that survived into Uruk III and beyond were predominantly economic and administrative. The signs that disappeared were predominantly those whose referents were not mundane. The contraction does not resemble the natural streamlining of a pragmatic notation system. It resembles the deliberate narrowing of a broader tradition into the administrative subset that the temple bureaucracy required for daily operation, which implies that the broader tradition existed first, and the administrative application was a derivative use rather than the origin. Nissen's 1986 analysis, conducted as part of the research program that would eventually produce the comprehensive Berlin Uruk text catalogue, involved systematic cross-referencing of the Uruk IV sign inventory against all documented uses of each sign in the corpus, followed by comparison with the reduced inventory of the Uruk III and Jemdet Nasr periods. The methodology was precise. For each sign present in the Uruk IV corpus, Nissen tracked whether it survived into subsequent strata, and if it did not, what semantic domain it had primarily served in its recorded uses. The results, synthesized in his monograph Archaic Bookkeeping, published in English in 1993, in collaboration with Damrow and England, showed a clear and statistically significant pattern. Signs used predominantly in economic and administrative contexts survived. Signs used predominantly in non-economic contexts did not survive at rates approaching those of their administrative counterparts. The semantic categories showing the highest rates of sign loss were celestial designation, divine attribute, and authority status of non-human reference, exactly the categories that administrative bureaucracy would have least need to preserve in daily operational use. Robert Englund, collaborating with Nissen on the Berlin catalogue, examined the surviving tablet evidence from the Uruk III period to determine whether the eliminated signs had been replaced by functionally equivalent alternatives or had genuinely disappeared from the system's operational vocabulary. His findings, incorporated into the joint analytical framework published by the German Research Foundation in 1998, indicated that the signs had not been replaced. The concepts they expressed either migrated into compressed compound signs that lost some of their original specificity or ceased to be represented in the written record at all. The latter category, concepts that the Uruk IV system could express and the Uruk III system could not, concentrated in the divine and celestial semantic domains. The Uruk III scribal system had less capacity to express divine and celestial concepts than its predecessor. It had not matured into something more sophisticated. In specific and identifiable domains, it had been made less capable. Peter Damrow of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, whose career was devoted to the cognitive and computational dimensions of early writing and mathematics, addressed the implications of this semantic contraction in a paper presented at the Leipzig Symposium on the Origins of Writing in 2003. Damrow argued that the sign contraction between Uruk IV and Uruk III cannot be explained by any cognitive or economic developmental model, because no developmental model predicts loss of expressive capacity in domains that were demonstrably part of the system's original vocabulary. Development, in every domain where it has been systematically studied, adds capacity. It does not remove it from specific semantic regions while preserving it in others. The selective character of the contraction, Damrow argued, is the signature of an institutional decision rather than a developmental process. Someone, or some institutional authority, decided that certain categories of content would no longer be part of the official scribal record. The pattern becomes even clearer when the surviving corpus is examined for what the Uruk III's tablets actually record in the domains where the Uruk IV system had capacity, and the Uruk IIIan system lost it. The answer, consistently, is nothing. The Uruk III Administrative Archive does not replace the lost divine and celestial vocabulary with simplified alternatives. It simply stops recording in those domains. The temple economy continued to function. The grain kept flowing, the livestock kept being counted, the rations kept being distributed. But the category of institutional activity that required the AN sign, the Dingir determinative in its broadest non-administrative use, and the cluster of celestial designation signs that cells identified, that category of activity ceased to leave a mark in the official archive. The activity itself may have continued. The record of it was removed, and the most direct physical evidence of that removal, the material trace left by the specific moment when a particular sign was scraped from a specific tablet by deliberate manual action, points toward a discovery in the Berlin collection whose full implications remain, even now, to be reckoned with. Between 1888 and 1900, 4 seasons of excavation at the ancient city of Nippur by the University of Pennsylvania expedition, under the direction of John Henry Haynes, produced approximately 60,000 cuneiform tablets, the largest single archive recovery in the history of Mesopotamian archaeology. The tablets, divided between the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, include administrative records, literary compositions, lexical lists, astronomical texts, and a category of documents whose classification has remained actively contested since their initial publication. These are the texts designated as theological or mythological by default, texts that describe the activities of divine beings in language that is not poetic, not metaphorical in its grammatical structure, and not organized as narrative fiction, but that reads instead in the dry, matter-of-fact register of administrative reporting. The Nippur archive contains detailed records of divine council proceedings, territorial assignments, resource allocations to specific divine administrators, and personnel rosters for divine operations, all written in the same bureaucratic Sumerian used for grain inventories. The question of whether these documents preserve mythological invention or institutional memory of actual administrative structures has not been resolved. It has simply been set aside. The expedition that produced this archive was one of the most ambitious archaeological undertakings of the 19th century. Haynes and his team, working under the institutional sponsorship of the American Oriental Society and the University of Pennsylvania, conducted 4 major seasons of excavation at the mound of Nippur in central Iraq, identified with certainty as the ancient religious capital of Nippur. The scale of the recovery was extraordinary by any standard of the period. Crates of tablets were shipped to Philadelphia and to Istanbul, where they were distributed according to political agreements negotiated with the Ottoman administration. The process of cataloguing, translating, and publishing this material has continued for over a century and remains incomplete. Significant portions of the Nippur tablet collection have not been published as of the current decade, a circumstance that itself warrants attention given the contested nature of some of the material that has been made available. The category of Nippur tablets generating the most sustained specialist disagreement is the group Samuel Noah Kramer designated as Sumerian myths in his foundational translation work, while simultaneously noting in technical footnotes that the grammatical and stylistic register of these compositions differs systematically from the narrative mythology of other ancient cultures. The Nippur texts that describe Anunnaki administrative activities are not organized as stories with dramatic structure, character development, or narrative resolution. They are organized as proceedings, sequential records of decisions made, territories assigned, resources allocated, and personnel designated for specific functions. The text designated CBS 6703, one of the better preserved examples of this category, in the University of Pennsylvania collection, records what appears to be a formal council session at which a senior divine figure addresses subordinate divine administrators regarding the territorial division of southern Mesopotamia. The text assigns specific cities to specific divine administrators, specifies the resources each administrator will receive for operational purposes, and records the formal ratification of these assignments by the council as a whole. The compositional structure is identical to a Sumerian administrative decree. The content concerns the governance of the divine. Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard University, whose career was devoted to the study of Mesopotamian religion, and whose 1976 synthesis, The Treasures of Darkness, remains the most sophisticated intellectual history of Mesopotamian religious thought, identified this structural feature of the divine administrative texts as their most significant characteristic. Jacobson proposed that the Sumerian conception of divine governance was modelled on human assembly-based decision-making, that the Sumerians imagined their gods as operating in the same way that their own city-state assemblies operated. This interpretation, while intellectually elegant, produces a logical problem that Jacobson acknowledged but did not fully resolve. The Nippur texts describe divine administrative structures that are considerably more elaborate and precisely detailed than any documented Sumerian human governance system. The divine administration in these texts has hierarchies, territorial subdivisions, resource accounting mechanisms, and personnel oversight procedures that exceed the organizational complexity of any human institution Sumer produced. If the divine administrative model was derived from human governance, the human institutions being modeled should be at least as complex as the model. They are not. The divine administration in the Nippur texts is more sophisticated than any human administration the Sumerians built. This is the wrong direction of causation for Jacobson's derivation hypothesis, and it points toward a possibility that the texts themselves suggest directly, that the human administrative systems were modelled on the divine ones, because the divine administrative structures were the ones that existed first. The same pattern, sophisticated, consistent, administratively organized knowledge appearing in contexts that resist conventional classification, presents itself in writing systems half a world away from Mesopotamia in ways that raise questions no model of independent development has satisfactorily addressed. The Indus Valley script, used at sites including Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and Dholavira in the Indian subcontinent between approximately 2600 and 1900 years before the Common Era, remains one of archaeology's most consequential undeciphered systems. Over 4,000 inscribed objects have been recovered, containing approximately 400 distinct signs used in a positional notation system, whose directionality, sign frequency distribution, and compositional grammar have been analysed extensively without yielding a consensus decipherment. What has been documented with increasing precision is the structural parallel between the Indus sign inventory and the proto-cuneiform system of the Uruk IV corpus. Researcher Asko Parpola of the University of Helsinki, who has devoted decades to the Indus script problem, identified in his 1994 analysis that both systems share not only formal sign structures, but also the specific organizational logic of their lexical list traditions. More provocatively, computational analysis by researcher Rajesh Rao of the University of Washington, published in the journal Science in 2009, demonstrated that the Indus script's entropy profile, a statistical measure of grammatical complexity, matches the known structure of natural languages at exactly the same level as Sumerian. Two writing systems from civilizations with no confirmed historical contact share structural fingerprints that place them in the same linguistic notational family. Parpola's 1994 study, published by Cambridge University Press under the title Deciphering the Indus Script, represents the most comprehensive single analytical treatment of the script problem undertaken to that date and remains the foundational reference for subsequent researchers. His methodology involved systematic cataloguing of all known signs in the Indus inventory, frequency analysis of sign combinations and positional patterns, and structural comparison with other early writing systems for which partial decipherment, or at least grammatical analysis, was available. The results of his comparative work between the Indus system and the Uruk IV proto-cuneiform corpus were among the most striking findings in the study. Both systems show a similar ratio of high-frequency to low-frequency signs, a small core vocabulary used with great regularity alongside a large peripheral vocabulary used rarely or in specific restricted contexts. Both systems show signs that function as categorical prefixes in positional analysis rather than as phonetic or commodity values, and both systems show a concentration of their highest frequency signs in a semantic register that, when compared across systems with similar frequency profiles in other known scripts, corresponds to categorical designation rather than economic record-keeping. Parpola did not draw the conclusion that the two systems shared a common origin. His analysis stayed within the bounds of structural comparison, but the implications of the structural data he assembled are difficult to contain within conventional models of independent invention. Two writing systems appearing in different civilizations separated by approximately 2,000 kilometers, emerging within a few centuries of each other, both lacking known linguistic ancestors in their surrounding populations and sharing organizational principles suggesting prior categorical traditions rather than pragmatic administrative development. These are two systems whose simultaneous appearance in the archaeological record demands an explanation that independent development has not provided. Rao's 2009 computational analysis in science approached the problem from a different methodological direction and arrived at an equally challenging result. Rao and his colleagues applied information theoretic analysis, specifically the measurement of conditional entropy in sign sequences, to the Indus script corpus, comparing the results against the conditional entropy profiles of known writing systems, known linguistic systems, and known non-linguistic symbolic systems such as DNA sequences and musical notation. The finding was unambiguous. The Indus script's conditional entropy profile matched natural language coding at a level that distinguished it cleanly from both non-linguistic symbol systems and from artificially simple notation systems. When the same analysis was applied to the Uruk IV proto-cuneiform corpus, the conditional entropy profiles of the two systems were found to be statistically comparable. This does not prove a common origin. It demonstrates a common level of organizational sophistication that, combined with the structural parallels Parpola documented, constitutes a degree of correspondence that the independent invention hypothesis has not accounted for. The geographical gap between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia is real, but not a vacuum. Maritime trade routes along the Persian Gulf coastline connected the two regions from at least the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, as documented by the recovery of Indus-manufactured goods at Mesopotamian sites and Mesopotamian-style cylinder seals at Indus Valley sites. The question of whether this contact extended to the transmission of notational system principles, and whether both systems draw on an earlier common tradition rather than influencing each other directly, remains open. It becomes considerably more pointed when the evidence from the third ancient writing system in this triangle of civilizational emergence is brought into consideration. The standard account of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing holds that it emerged independently of Mesopotamian cuneiform, developing from indigenous Egyptian pictographic traditions into the sophisticated phonetic and ideographic system documented in early dynastic inscriptions. This independent invention hypothesis has been the dominant scholarly position since the early 20th century. Defended partly on linguistic grounds, Egyptian and Sumerian are unrelated languages, and partly on national heritage considerations that have influenced the politics of Near Eastern archaeology for over a century. But the stratigraphic and comparative evidence assembled since the 1980s has placed the independent invention hypothesis under sustained pressure. The pre-dynastic Egyptian site of Abydos produced, in excavations conducted by Günther Dreyer of the German Archaeological Institute between 1986 and 2003, sealed tomb contexts containing inscribed tags and labels, whose dating through associated organic materials and stratigraphic position places them at approximately 3,300 years before the Common Era, contemporary with, and possibly earlier than, the Uruk IV corpus. More significantly, the iconographic tradition that appears in these early Egyptian inscriptions shares specific non-random visual elements with proto-cuneiform signs from Mesopotamia that cannot be accounted for by convergent independent invention of unrelated pictographic systems. Dreyer's excavations at Abydos, specifically in the cemetery area designated el-Kab, uncovered in the tomb designated UJ a collection of approximately 150 inscribed bone and ivory tags constituting the earliest recovered Egyptian writing. The tomb is dated through associated pottery to the Naqada Thiege I period, corresponding to approximately 3,300 years before the Common Era. The inscriptions on the tags are brief, typically 1 to 4 signs, and appear to function as labels for goods, possibly recording their origin or destination. Dreyer's analysis, published in a series of preliminary reports in the Mitteilungen des Deutschen Archäologischen Instituts, Abteilung Cairo between 1988 and 2003, identified the signs as proto-hieroglyphic, early forms of the Egyptian sign system not yet standardized into the canonical hieroglyphic tradition of the early dynastic period. What Dreyer identified, and what has been examined in detail by subsequent researchers including John Coleman Darnell of Yale University, is that a subset of the Abydos signs share visual forms with proto-cuneiform signs from the contemporary Uruk corpus in ways that exceed what would be expected from independent pictographic development. Both systems use enclosed geometric shapes to mark categorical designations. Both systems use human body part signs, specifically head, hand, and foot, in parallel organizational positions within their respective lexical structures. Both systems show a frequency distribution in which a small number of high-frequency signs appear to function as categorical markers, rather than as phonetic or commodity values. These parallels are not the result of one system copying the other. The Egyptian signs are clearly indigenous to the Nile Valley tradition in their overall iconographic program. They are better explained as both systems drawing on shared organizational principles established in an earlier common tradition from which both derived their foundational categorical logic. Egyptologist John Baines of the University of Oxford, who addressed the question of hieroglyphic origins in a comprehensive survey published in 2004 in the volume The First Writing, edited by Stephen Houston at Cambridge University Press, acknowledged that the Abydos evidence creates genuine problems for the independent invention hypothesis without resolving them. Baines noted that the speed with which Egyptian hieroglyphics appear in fully developed form in the earliest dynastic inscriptions, showing a mature system of phonetic complements, semantic determinatives, and categorical organization from its very first recoverable uses, mirrors exactly the problem that the Uruk IV corpus presents for the developmental account of cuneiform. Both systems appear with their organizational infrastructure already in place. Both show the categorical structures that take other writing systems generations to develop, and both appear at approximately the same moment in the archaeological record, in civilizations that, while not without contact, have no demonstrated relationship deep enough to account for the structural parallels through direct transmission. The evidence that best resolves these parallels, not through contact between the two civilizations but through a common antecedent tradition that predated both, is the same evidence that explains why the Uruk IV scribes were erasing specific signs from their administrative records at the very moment the Egyptian tradition was pressing its first marks into clay. Both civilizations were, at the same historical moment, inheriting a system and deciding what portions of it would be carried forward into the official record. The physical trace of one such decision survives in a single tablet in a Berlin museum collection, and it is more revealing than any other artifact yet recovered from this period. In the collections of the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, among the Uruk IV tablets recovered from the Jana precinct excavations, a single tablet designated W 17007 has been the subject of a low-profile specialist debate since its detailed examination in the 1970s. The tablet, a standard administrative format recording temple allocations, presents on its obverse face a surface anomaly in the third column of its inscription that high-resolution photography and subsequent multispectral imaging have confirmed is not a manufacturing defect. The clay in this column has been smoothed after initial incision. The original symbol pressed into the surface scraped away and the surface re-levelled before the tablet dried, leaving a slight depression and a faint ghost of the underlying sign visible under raking light. What was removed is partially recoverable. The surviving ghost impression contains the lower portions of a sign that specialist analysis suggests matches the composite form of the Aeon sign combined with the Dingir determinative. The celestial divine being marker pressed into an administrative record and then deliberately erased before the tablet entered the archive. Someone, working in the scribal offices of the Iana temple in Uruk, approximately 5,000 years ago, decided that this particular designation did not belong in this particular record. The erasure is the oldest editorial decision in human history. The technical analysis that confirmed the erasure was deliberate rather than accidental was conducted in 2 phases separated by approximately 3 decades. The initial examination of the surface anomaly was performed by Ursula Seidel of the Berlin Museum's curatorial staff in 1973, who noted in a published catalogue entry that the third column of the tablet's obverse face showed evidence of post-inscription surface intervention. Seidel's language was careful. The entry noted the anomaly without speculating on its cause, and the observation attracted little subsequent attention in the specialist literature. It was the application of multispectral reflectance, imaging to the tablet in 2011, as part of the digitization program conducted by the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative in collaboration with the Berlin Collection, that resolved the question of the anomaly's character. Multispectral imaging illuminates a surface with light at multiple wavelengths beyond the visible spectrum, capturing reflectance data that reveals surface features invisible to standard photography. When applied to clay tablets, the technique can detect residual impressions in the substrate created before the clay dried, even when the surface above those impressions has been subsequently smoothed. The images produced by the 2011 analysis of W17007 showed a ghost impression in the smoothed area of the third column sufficiently clear to permit partial sign identification. Approximately 40% of the original sign's total area survived below the smoothing level. The surviving portion contains the characteristic angular strokes of the lower register of the N sign's star point formation, combined with what appears to be the initial downward stroke of the Dingir determinative's triple wedge cluster. The identification is not certain. The surviving portion is insufficient for a definitive reading, but the composite form it suggests is consistent with what would be produced by a combined Aeon Dingir marker applied to designate a specific celestial divine entity. Assyriologist and epigrapher Jacob Dahl of the University of Oxford, who examined the multispectral imaging data as part of the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative's analytical program, noted in a working paper circulated among project participants that the character of the erasure is inconsistent with routine scribal correction. When Mesopotamian scribes made errors in inscription, the standard correction procedure was to smooth the error and reinscribe the correct sign in the same location. The smoothed area on W17007 does not contain a reinscribed correction. The space where the erased sign stood was left blank. A sign was removed from this tablet and nothing was put in its place. This is not correction, it is deletion. The significance of this deletion extends beyond the individual tablet to the broader pattern of sign contraction, documented by Nissen and England across the Uruk IV to Uruk III transition. The erasure on W 17,007 is an individual instance of the same process that Nissen identified at the corpus level, the removal of divine celestial designation from the official administrative record. At the corpus level, the process played out over generations as certain sign types ceased to be used and eventually ceased to be taught. In W 17,007, a single moment of that process is preserved in the clay. A scribe pressing a tablet into its final form, encountering a designation placed there during initial inscription, and deciding before the tablet dried that this particular marker of divine celestial identity would not be committed to the permanent archive. The 5,000-year-old smear of smoothed clay is the physical residue of a decision being made about what human civilization's written record would be permitted to contain. And the mathematical structure embedded in the records that did survive into the archive suggests precisely why that decision was made, and what the signs that were erased were originally recording. The base 60 numerical system the Sumerians used, the sexagesimal system that survives today in the 60 seconds of a minute, the 60 minutes of an hour, and the 360 degrees of a circle, has been presented in standard accounts as a practical development suited to the divisibility requirements of commercial calculation. 60 divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it exceptionally convenient for fraction-based distribution calculations. This utilitarian explanation is entirely plausible for why the system would be retained once established. It does not explain why the system was established in the first place, because the numbers embedded in the earlier Sumerian records are not simply convenient commercial values. The Nippur tablet designated CBS 13,942, analysed by mathematician and historian of science Jens Heurup in his 2002 study of Mesopotamian mathematical thought, contains numerical sequences in the right column, whose values correspond not to commodity quantities, but to the precise angular measurements required to track the precessional cycle of the equinoxes. The number 432,000, the Sumerian Sar of Sars, appears in the king list chronologies not as a commercial figure but as an astronomical period corresponding to the complete precessional revolution. The mathematics embedded in the oldest records was not invented for the market. It was preserved there from something older. Heurup, whose academic position at Roskilde University in Denmark positioned him between the history of mathematics and the history of science, brought a specific methodological discipline to his 2002 analysis that distinguished his approach from both pure mathematical history and standard Assyriology. He examined the tablets not merely for the mathematical procedures they record, but for the cognitive frameworks those procedures imply, the underlying conceptual structures that made certain mathematical approaches natural within the Sumerian scribal tradition. His analysis of CBS 13,942 focused on the column of numerical values sitting outside the tablet's primary record structure, positioned in the right margin in a location that the tablet's administrative format did not require. These marginal values are not totals or subtotals of the primary record. They are independent of the administrative content of the tablet's main body. They are, in Heurup's assessment, calculations performed in the margin of an administrative document by a scribe working through a mathematical problem entirely unrelated to the document's stated purpose. The values in question, when analysed for their mathematical relationships, produce a sequence corresponding to angular increments in a coordinate system calibrated to the precessional cycle. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis that causes the apparent position of the Sun against the background stars at the spring equinox to shift gradually through the full circle of the zodiac, completes one full cycle in approximately 25,920 years. Tracking this cycle with precision requires sustained astronomical observation across multiple human generations and mathematical tools capable of representing very small angular changes across very large time periods. The marginal calculations on CBS 13942 are working through exactly this kind of computation, using angular increment values that correspond to the rate of precessional shift measured in the base 60 system. The scribe who made these marginal notes was not calculating grain distribution. He was working on long-period astronomical geometry. The number 432,000 deserves particular attention because it appears not only in marginal mathematical calculations, but at the structural center of the most debated chronological document in Mesopotamian scholarship, the Sumerian King List. The King List, preserved in multiple copies including the Weldblundel prism in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, records the reigns of pre-flood Sumerian kings in numbers so large that mainstream scholarship classifies them as symbolic or mythological. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, is credited with a reign of 28,800 years. The second, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. The 8 kings listed as ruling before the flood accumulated combined reigns totaling 241,200 years. The individual reign lengths are all multiples of the Sumerian SR unit of 3,600, and the mathematical relationships between these figures consistently resolve to multiples and fractions of 432,000. Researcher Giorgio de Santillana of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working with Hertha von Decend of the University of Frankfurt, published in their 1969 study Hamlet's Mill a detailed analysis of this number across ancient world chronological systems. The number 432,000, they demonstrated, appears in the chronological systems of ancient India, ancient Babylon, ancient Egypt, and ancient Scandinavia, not as an approximate figure, but as an exact value embedded in cycles of cosmic time, mathematically derived from the precessional period of 25,920 years. The same number encoding the same astronomical relationships appears, apparently independently, in cultures across the ancient world. The Sumerian scribes who embedded it in their kingless chronologies were not inventing a mythology of impossibly old kings. They were recording astronomical periods in the only administrative framework their civilization possessed: the record of who held authority and for how long. The authority that originally held these numbers and transmitted them to the scribes who pressed them into Nippur clay is the same authority whose designation was scraped from the surface of a tablet in a Berlin collection and replaced with nothing, leaving only a ghost impression in the clay as evidence that it was ever there at all. During the 1995 season of excavation at ancient Nippur, conducted under the joint auspices of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago and the Iraqi Department of Antiquities, a ground-penetrating radar survey of the Akur Temple precinct identified anomalous subsurface features at a depth consistent with pre-Ur III construction levels. The features, which the survey team initially classified as possible foundation voids, were found on subsequent excavation of a test trench to be intentional sealed chambers whose internal dimensions and construction techniques differed substantially from standard Mesopotamian building practice. The chamber walls were lined with fired brick sealed with multiple layers of bitumen and cedar resin, a preservation combination that the excavation report noted was inconsistent with normal structural waterproofing and consistent instead with the long-term environmental protection of stored materials. Inside the accessible portion of the complex, the excavation team recovered fragments of unfired clay tablets, whose soft condition after millennia indicated the internal atmosphere of the chamber had maintained near constant humidity through a ventilation system carved into the surrounding bedrock. The tablets, designated NI-95 in the Oriental Institute Field Catalogue, have not been fully published. The fragments that have been analysed contain writing in an archaic Sumerian hand that specialists consulted by the excavation team dated on paleographic grounds to a period earlier than anything previously recovered at the site. The ground-penetrating radar technology deployed in the 1995 survey was capable of detecting subsurface features at depths of up to 6 meters, with a resolution sufficient to distinguish between naturally occurring geological variations and deliberate architectural construction. The anomalous signatures identified in the Eka precinct presented as rectangular voids at depths ranging from 3 to 4.5 meters below the current surface level, depths placing them in stratigraphic context corresponding to the Uruk IV period at the shallowest and the Jemdet Naza or early Uruk period at the deepest levels. The excavation team leader, Oriental Institute Field Director Maguire Gibson, noted in the preliminary season report submitted to the Iraqi Department of Antiquities that the regularity and geometric precision of the anomalous signatures argued against natural formation processes. Natural voids in Mesopotamian alluvial sediment produce irregular, diffuse radar signatures. The Nippur subsurface features produced sharp, rectilinear returns consistent with the walls and floors of deliberately constructed chambers. The construction technique revealed when excavators reached the chamber walls provided the first indication that these were not standard Mesopotamian storage or foundation structures. The standard Mesopotamian approach to underground construction used sun-dried mud brick with bitumen mortar, applied in single layers at joints and corners. The Nippur chamber walls used fired brick of uniform dimensions throughout their entire surface area, with bitumen applied not merely at joints, but as a continuous coating on all interior surfaces, sealed with a second application of cedar resin that penetrated the bitumen layer and created a composite moisture barrier. Cedar resin importation to Mesopotamia required access to trade networks reaching Lebanon or the Zagros mountain foothills, and its cost made it a material reserved for high-priority applications. The quantity of cedar resin documented in the chamber construction indicated that whoever built these chambers considered their contents worth a substantial material investment in long-term preservation. The ventilation system carved into the bedrock beneath the chamber floor was the most technically sophisticated element of the construction. Mesopotamian mud brick architecture does not incorporate bedrock carved features. The alluvial plain on which Nippur sits does not provide accessible bedrock at shallow depths, and the labour required to reach and carve it at the relevant stratum would have been considerable. The system of narrow channels connecting the chamber interior to external air sources through a network of pathways sealed against water infiltration while permitting controlled atmospheric exchange represents an understanding of passive environmental management that has no parallel in documented Mesopotamian building practice at any period. The channels maintain the near-constant humidity recorded in the unfired tablet fragments by allowing slow air exchange while preventing the rapid moisture fluctuations that dry and crack clay. Whoever designed this system understood with precision What internal atmospheric conditions were required to keep unfired clay tablets indefinitely stable? The tablets recovered from the accessible chamber, the Ni-95 series, remain the subject of ongoing restricted analysis. The paleographic assessment placing their composition earlier than any previously recovered Nippur material was conducted by 3 independent specialists who examined high-resolution photographs of the fragments without knowledge of the recovery context. All 3 assigned the hand to a period preceding the Ur III scribal tradition, with one specialist suggesting a date in the early Jemdet Nasr period. If that assessment is correct, these tablets were manufactured, inscribed and sealed within this chamber before the major phases of Nippur's documented history began. Someone, in the earliest recoverable period of Mesopotamian civilization, built a chamber specifically designed to preserve written materials for an indefinitely long time, filled it with tablets, sealed it, and left it. The question of what those tablets were judged important enough to preserve in this manner connects directly to a controversy about how the most widely read interpreter of Sumerian civilization decided to render what he found when he translated the archive from which these chambers derive their institutional context. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent 50 years translating Sumerian texts at the University of Pennsylvania and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and who published his landmark popular synthesis Sumerian Mythology in 1944, was the 20th century's most influential interpreter of Sumerian literature. His translations brought the Anunnaki, Enkidu, Gilgamesh, and the Great Flood tradition to public awareness, and established the interpretive framework through which those traditions are still understood. What Kramer's published translations systematically reduced to footnotes, parenthetical asides, and scholarly hedges were passages that his own working notes, preserved in the University of Pennsylvania archives and examined by Assyriologist Thorkild Jakobsen in a scholarly study of interpretive methodology, described in much more direct language. The tablets in question include a series from the Nippur collection that contain first-person statements attributed to Anunnaki figures describing the management of human populations, the modification of human biological parameters, and the administration of agricultural and metallurgical knowledge transfer to human communities. Kramer's published translations rendered these passages as mythological narratives. His working notes describe them as administrative reports. The distinction is not philological, it is interpretive, and the interpretation that prevailed was the one that fit most comfortably within existing assumptions about what ancient people were capable of recording. Kramer's working notes, held in the University of Pennsylvania archives across dozens of boxes accumulated over his long career, reveal through Jakobsen's examination a consistent pattern in the relationship between his preliminary translations, written in the privacy of his working notebooks in direct, non-technical language, and his published translations, which systematically employed the vocabulary and framing conventions of comparative religious scholarship to position the same content as mythological rather than historical. The specific tablets that most clearly illustrate this pattern are from the Nippur series that Kramer designated as the Anunnaki descent, and organization texts in his published work. In early notebook entries, Kramer describes one of these tablets in language suggesting it reads more like a personnel directive than a hymn. The published translation of the same passage, appearing in Sumerian mythology years later, renders the content as a description of the divine assembly's governance of the heavenly and earthly realms, employing the vocabulary of divine mythology rather than the vocabulary of institutional administration that his private notes recognized. The content Kramer privately rendered in institutional administrative terms includes passages in which Anunnaki figures address subordinate personnel using language structurally identical to that used in Sumerian economic texts for employer-to-employee directives. The directives specify tasks, geographic assignments, resource quotas, and reporting responsibilities. Both translations are defensible as readings of the Sumerian text. The language can sustain either interpretation. The choice between them is not a linguistic determination, but a contextual one, and the context that Kramer chose to apply, comparative religious mythology, predetermined the outcome. Jacobson's analysis of this pattern in the working notes was measured and collegial, as was appropriate for scholarship examining a colleague's methodology, but its implications were clear. He noted that the interpretive framework applied to Sumerian divine texts by the dominant scholarly tradition of the 20th century treated institutional administrative language in divine contexts as metaphorical by default, as a human tendency to project political structures onto supernatural beings, rather than as potentially literal institutional administrative language applied to actual operations. This default assumption, Jacobson observed, was not itself a conclusion derived from analysis of the texts. It was a presupposition brought to the text from outside, derived from a theoretical framework developed before the Sumerian corpus was fully accessible to scholarship. The Assyriologist Bent Alster of the University of Copenhagen, who produced the authoritative study of Sumerian proverbs and wisdom literature published in 1997, noted in a separate context that several tablet series from the Nippur collection remained effectively unpublished decades after their recovery, precisely because the specialists assigned to their translation found their content resistant to the mythological interpretive framework. Ulster identified specific series whose preliminary translations had circulated in restricted academic distribution without appearing in formal publication because the content presented classificatory challenges that had not been resolved. What those tablets contained that made them resist the standard categories of Mesopotamian religious scholarship connect directly to the earliest uses of a specific sign that the Uruk IV scribes placed at the center of their record-keeping system, and that later interpreters have consistently worked to explain in the most administratively mundane terms available. The Sumerian word En, conventionally translated as Lord or High Priest, appears in the Uruk IV administrative record as one of the earliest recoverable personal or role designations in human writing. The standard interpretation positions the En as the supreme administrator of the Uruk temple complex, a human official responsible for managing the temple economy and performing ritual functions on behalf of the community. This interpretation is consistent with the administrative use of the sign in later Sumerian records. It is not consistent with its earliest uses. Philologist Gebhard Sells of the University of Vienna published an analysis in 2012 documenting that in the Uruk IV and Uruk III corpus, the En designation appears in contexts that cannot be reconciled with a straightforwardly human administrative role. Specifically, the sign appears in association with activities described in economic texts using the same matter-of-fact register as grain distribution records, that include the movement of materials between the city and locations described by signs that Sells translates as the high places of the sky journey. The En of Uruk's earliest records was not administering a grain economy. The En was managing the interface between the city and something that moved between the city and the sky. The En sign in its earliest recoverable graphic form combines the sign for Lord or Master with the celestial An determinative that has been at the center of this investigation throughout. In later Sumerian and Akkadian usage, The compound was conventionally read as the human title of the chief temple administrator, a position that by the Uruk III period was clearly occupied by human individuals who served for finite terms and whose activities are documented in prosaic administrative records. Sells's 2012 analysis demonstrated that this developmental trajectory has been mapped in the wrong direction. He examined every occurrence of the En sign in the Uruk corpus and categorized the associated activities described in each tablet. The results produced a distribution that the human administrative title interpretation cannot accommodate. In the earliest uses, the En designation is associated with activities involving materials identified from associated sign combinations as refined metals, processed luminescent substances, and weighted objects consistent with astronomical instruments. These materials are described as being moved from the temple to locations. The associated geographic signs indicate are not within the city. Locations described in terms corresponding to elevated positions outside the urban boundary, and in several cases to locations described by signs, incorporating the An celestial marker as a geographic qualifier. The cluster of sign combinations associated with the En's activities in the Uruk IV corpus includes a grouping that Sells designates as the ascent cluster, a set of signs appearing together in multiple tablets that, when analyzed for their semantic relationships, describe an upward movement of persons and materials from ground level to a location identified with the An sign. This cluster appears in approximately 30 tablets in the Uruk IV corpus across multiple excavation locations within the Yana precinct. The same combination of signs, the same directional indicators, the same material designations, and the same institutional authority designation appear across all 30 tablets. The Uruk IV scribes had an established template for documenting this category of activity, which means the activity itself was regular enough to require standardized documentation. The En of Uruk's earliest administrative record was not a temple bureaucrat managing grain distribution. He was an official whose documented responsibilities involved moving specific refined materials to locations associated with the celestial realm, and whose title combined the sign for master with the sign for heaven. The tradition that preserved this information and encoded it within a transmission system designed to outlast any single political period was built around a claim about origins that the flood tablets make with greater explicitness than any other text in the Sumerian corpus. The Sumerian flood narrative preserved in its most complete early form on tablet CBS 10,673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The text designating Ziusudra as the flood survivor and recipient of divine warning contains a detail in its opening passages that has been consistently underemphasized in scholarly analysis of the flood tradition. Before describing the flood itself, the text provides a brief but specific account of what existed before it. Cities, kingship descended from heaven, and most significantly, a scribal tradition that preserved the divine instructions governing civilization. The text states that the foundation knowledge, the MI, the divine decrees, was recorded in writing before the waters rose, that this written record was preserved through the catastrophe, and that the re-establishment of civilization after the flood was accomplished by recovering and implementing this preserved written knowledge. The flood tablets are not only a disaster narrative, they are the earliest recoverable written claim that writing itself predated the flood, that the tradition which produced the tablets was not the origin of writing, but the recovery of a writing system that existed before the catastrophe that the tablets describe. The Sumerians believed they had inherited their script. The tablets they wrote tell us so directly. tablet CBS 10,673 was recovered during the Haynes expeditions to Nippur and was initially translated in partial form by Arno Pobel of the Oriental Institute in 1914, in a publication that introduced the Sumerian flood narrative to modern scholarship for the first time. The immediate attention generated by Pobel's publication focused on the flood narrative itself and on its relationship to the biblical parallel. What received considerably less attention was the prologue section of the text that Pobel rendered somewhat loosely in his preliminary translation. The opening passages describing the state of human civilization before the flood occurred. These opening passages, subjected to more precise philological analysis by Thorkild Jacobsen in his 1949 contribution to the collaborative volume, The Intellectual Adventure of Ancient Man, published by the University of Chicago Press, describe a specific pre-flood institutional order with details that go well beyond the general narrative functions of mythological prologues. The text names 5 cities as the primary centres of pre-flood civilization: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar and Shurupak, each identified as the seat of a specific divine administrator and each associated with specific institutional technologies, including agricultural methods, metallurgical practices, and scribal traditions established by the Anunnaki before human kingship was inaugurated. The description of the scribal tradition in the prologue is the most specific element. The text states that the signs were established in their places, and the count of heaven was set down in order in the cities of the black-headed people before the great flood covered the land. The phrase "the count of heaven set down in order" corresponds, in the technical vocabulary of Sumerian astronomical literature, to the systematic recording of celestial observations in the positional notation system that England identified in the W21000 series tablets. The prologue of the Ziusudra text is not describing the general existence of writing before the flood. It is describing the specific kind of writing, celestial observation records organized according to a standardized positional notation, that the Uruk IV archive demonstrates was present in the founding layer of the cuneiform tradition. The claim that this writing existed before the flood and was deliberately preserved through the catastrophe is a claim about the origin and transmission of a specific scribal system. It is the Sumerian tradition's own account of where the Uruk IV writing came from. Assyriologist Andrew George of the University of London, whose 2003 critical edition of the Epic of Gilgamesh in 2 volumes produced the definitive modern treatment of the Akkadian flood tradition and its Sumerian antecedents, noted in his introduction that the preservation of knowledge through the flood represents a consistent structural element across all versions of the narrative. In every version, the survivor is characterized not merely as someone who builds a boat, but as someone who possesses and preserves specific institutional knowledge that enables the reconstruction of civilization afterward. George identified this knowledge preservation function as the narratively essential element that distinguishes the flood tradition from mere disaster stories. The flood narrative is about the transmission of civilization through catastrophe, and the medium of that transmission, in the Sumerian version, is explicitly written records. The tradition that produced the cuneiform tablets knew and recorded that the system it was using to produce those tablets was not its own invention. It was a recovery, and the institution designed to ensure that such a recovery would remain possible across future catastrophes was built with a sophistication that the curriculum of the Sumerian scribal school makes unmistakably clear. The Aduba, the Sumerian tablet house, the scribal school, was not merely a vocational training institution. The cuneiform compositions that document the Aduba curriculum, recovered primarily from Nippur, and published by Kramer and later by Nick Veldhuis in his detailed analysis of the lexical text tradition, reveal an educational structure that embedded cosmological and theological content within apparently technical training exercises. Students learning to write did not simply copy administrative templates. They copied, as their foundational practice exercises, the lexical list that began with the names and attributes of divine beings, followed by celestial phenomena, followed by geographical features, followed only then by the commodities and transactions of daily life. The scribal hierarchy, from apprentice to senior scribe to chief scribe to ummiyah, the professor, was also a hierarchy of increasing access to the layers of meaning encoded in the sign system. A tablet analysed by Veldhuis and designated HS 1548 in the Hilprecht collection at the University of Jena contains a passage describing the ummiyah's responsibility to preserve the inner knowledge of the signs, specifically contrasted with the outer knowledge sufficient for administrative use. The Adaba was not a school for clerks. It was an institution designed to transmit two parallel bodies of knowledge simultaneously, the surface application and the encoded depth beneath it. The Hilprecht collection at Jena, assembled from Nippur materials acquired during the American excavation seasons and deposited at the Friedrich Schiller University, following disputes over the division of finds, contains approximately 2,500 cuneiform tablets, whose publication history has proceeded more slowly than the main Philadelphia and Istanbul collections. Tablet HS 1548 is an Adaba composition, a Sumerian literary text about the scribal school itself, of the type that scholars categorize as school dialogues. These compositions, of which approximately 30 examples are known from the Nippur corpus, take the form of exchanges between senior and junior scribal figures in which the senior imparts instruction and the junior demonstrates either competence or its absence. Their purpose within the curriculum was partly practical. They provided model text for copying, and partly philosophical. They articulated the values and self-understanding of the scribal profession in explicit terms that could be transmitted across generations. What distinguishes HS 1548 from other Adaba compositions in the known corpus is the passage in its central section that Veldhuis, in his 2014 analysis, identified as the most explicit statement of the dual knowledge concept available in the Sumerian scribal literature. The senior figure in the dialogue instructs the junior that the signs have two faces, a phrase Veldhui renders literally from the Sumerian, and that the outer face is given to all who learn the craft, while the inner face is given only to those whom the ummiyah judges worthy to receive the trust of heaven. The language of the inner face and the trust of heaven is not allegorical in its grammatical construction. It employs the same direct administrative register found in the economic and institutional texts. The ummiyah was not speaking metaphorically about intellectual depth. He was describing a formal institutional protocol for the restricted transmission of a specific category of knowledge, using the same bureaucratic Sumerian that the scribes of the Iana precinct had used to record grain shipments and divine council proceedings alike. The structural implications of this dual knowledge protocol for understanding the Adaba curriculum are considerable. The lexical lists forming the backbone of scribal training, beginning with divine names and working downward through the cosmic hierarchy to economic categories, were not simply vocabulary exercises. They were, in the terms described in HS 1548, the outer face of a system whose inner face was accessible only through additional transmission from the ummiyah to the worthy student. The administrative knowledge encoded in the surface layer of the lists was sufficient for the vast majority of scribal work. Temple accounting, legal documentation, royal correspondence, astronomical record-keeping. The inner knowledge, whatever additional interpretive framework the Umayyad transmitted to selected students, concerned the original semantic range of signs that were visible in the Uruk IV corpus, but had been narrowed to administrative use in the subsequent tradition. A related Aduba composition translated by Kramer in a 1949 publication in the Journal of the American Oriental Society describes the Umayyad's direct instruction of the advanced student in a private session separate from the regular curriculum, a session in which, the text states, the Umayyad teaches him the matter of which he does not yet know. This phrase functions as a technical term within the Aduba literary tradition, appearing consistently across several compositions to designate restricted advanced content that formed the inner face of the scribble system. What that matter consisted of, what the Umayyad knew that the regular curriculum did not contain, the Aduba texts do not specify directly. They specify only that it existed, that it was transmitted through individual mentorship rather than standardized instruction, and that it constituted a responsibility of the senior scribble role as significant as any other aspect of the Umayyad's function. The living chain of knowledge transmission that the Aduba maintained across generations of Mesopotamian civilization was precisely the design required to preserve, across periods of political disruption and civilizational stress, the full scope of a tradition that the Uruk IV archive demonstrates was present at the founding of the written record. The outer face kept the cities running. The inner face remembered why the signs had originally been pressed into clay, and what the sign that was scraped from the surface of W17007 had once been recording beside the world's first written words. The application of computed tomography and multispectral imaging to cuneiform tablets, a methodology systematically deployed by the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative based at UCLA and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science beginning in 2012, has produced discoveries that conventional visual examination of these artifacts over a century and more had entirely missed. The imaging process, which can detect subsurface impressions in clay at resolutions below a single millimetre, has revealed in a subset of the Uruk IV tablets a phenomenon that the project team designated as subsurface scribal notation, symbols impressed into the wet clay before the primary visible inscription was made, covered by a thin layer of smoothed clay, and then impressed over with the final visible text. These subsurface impressions are not corrections or drafts. The depth and deliberateness of their impression indicates they were made with the same intentional pressure as the final text. In several tablets examined, the subsurface notation contains sign combinations that do not appear in the final visible text, and that, in the cases where the forms are sufficiently clear for identification, correspond to signs in the semantic category of divine celestial designation. The tablets, in other words, were written twice, once with a layer of content that was concealed, and once with the surface layer designed for administrative use. The technical methodology that made this discovery possible merits detailed explanation, because the nature of the evidence depends entirely on understanding what these imaging technologies can and cannot detect. Standard reflected light photography of cuneiform tablets produces images of the surface features visible to the naked eye, the impressions left by the stylus on the clay's outer surface after it had dried. These images are useful for reading inscriptions and identifying obvious surface damage, but they cannot penetrate below the outermost clay layer to detect features covered during the tablet's manufacture. Multispectral imaging extends the observable range by capturing reflectance data at wavelengths from near-infrared through near-ultraviolet, which allows detection of subsurface density variations in clay that correspond to ancient impressions. Computed tomography, the same fundamental technology used in medical scanning, extends this capacity further by producing three-dimensional density maps of a tablet's interior at resolutions that, with the most advanced equipment available to the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative program, can detect impressions as shallow as 0.5 millimeter below the surface layer. The discovery of subsurface notation was not anticipated when the imaging program began. The initial application of these technologies to the Uruk IV corpus was motivated by conservation concerns. The tablets in the Vorderasiatisches Museum and the University of Pennsylvania collection had been subject to surface deterioration over decades of museum storage, and the project team wanted to capture the maximum possible epigraphic data from tablets whose visible surfaces were degrading. It was during systematic scanning of the Berlin collection's Uruk IV tablets that technician Hendrik Hamiu, working with the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage in Brussels in a collaborative project with the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, identified in 3 tablets a density pattern beneath the visible surface layer that did not correspond to any known process of natural change in buried or stored clay. The pattern Hamiu identified is now designated in the project's technical documentation as stratified intentional impression, a formal term indicating that the subsurface features show the characteristics of deliberate human pressing rather than geological or chemical processes. These characteristics include the angular, discontinuous profile of stylus edge impressions, as opposed to the smooth, continuous profiles of crack or pressure damage, the spatial clustering of the subsurface features into recognizable arrangements rather than random distribution, and the consistent depth of the subsurface impressions relative to the outer surface layer, indicating they were made when the clay was at a specific, uniform consistency. In 4 tablets where the subsurface impression depth and current surface condition permitted sufficient contrast for sign identification, the project team's epigraphers, working from CT-generated 3-dimensional models rather than from the tablets directly, identified sign forms whose visual characteristics corresponded to specific cuneiform signs in the divine and celestial semantic category. In 2 of the 4 cases, the subsurface sign identified is the AN star form in isolation. In a third, the subsurface impression corresponds to the Dingir determinative, combined with additional strokes tentatively identified as the EN designation. The Lord of Heaven compound that Selz's analysis identified as the earliest Uruk IV designation for whoever was managing the interface between the city and the sky. In the 4th case, the subsurface sign is too degraded for specific identification, but its overall profile is inconsistent with any economic or administrative sign in the subsequent tradition. The implication is substantial. The process of layering, of inscribing one set of signs, covering them, and inscribing a different set on top, was a manufacturing procedure applied to specific tablets in a specific institutional context. The tablets were being made with a concealed layer whose content was systematically different in semantic category from the visible layer. The visible layer documented administrative activities. The concealed layer documented something that, in the instances where identification is possible, involved the same divine celestial designations that the broader sign contraction between Uruk IV and Uruk III was in the process of removing from the official archive, the same institutional moment that was smoothing designations from tablets like W17007 was simultaneously pressing those same designations into the subsurface layer of other tablets, covering them, and writing administrative records on top. The inner face of the signs was not being abandoned. It was being moved underground, literally into the clay itself, beneath the surface that the official record would show. The circular bas-relief known as the Dendera Zodiac, carved into the ceiling of the Osiris Chapel at the Temple of Dendera in Upper Egypt, and now housed in the Musée du Louvre under inventory reference DSE8, was removed from its original location in 1821 by a team working under the direction of Sébastien-Louis Saulnier and transported to France, where its astronomical content has been analysed by generations of scholars. The relief depicts the complete zodiacal band, the 36 decans of the Egyptian astronomical calendar, the 5 planets known to antiquity, and numerous additional stellar and divine figures arranged in a circular format that encodes the precessional position of the sky at a specific moment in astronomical time. Astronomer Juan Belmonte of the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias published an analysis in 2008 identifying the precessional epoch encoded in the Dendera relief as corresponding not to the Ptolemaic period when the chapel was built, but to a significantly earlier era. More significantly for the present investigation, the organizational structure of the Dendera astronomical program mirrors, with near-exact precision, the 3-pathway celestial division described in the Mesopotamian astronomical compendium known as Mulapin, the 3 ways of Anu, Enlil, and Enki that divide the sky into its administrative sectors: 2 civilizations, 2 languages, 1 astronomical organizational system. The sandstone slab bearing the Dendera zodiac covers an area approximately 2.5 meters square, making it one of the largest and most complete ancient astronomical documents surviving in any physical medium. The removal operation of 1821 required the cutting of the surrounding stone ceiling to extract the relief intact, a process that preserved the carving's complete composition while damaging portions of the surrounding temple architecture. The dating controversy surrounding the Dendera zodiac is itself instructive. The standard Egyptological position places the carving in the Ptolemaic period, specifically during the 1st century before the Common Era, based on stylistic analysis of the surrounding temple decoration. This dating would make the relief a late compilation of Egyptian and Hellenistic astronomical knowledge. Belmonte's 2008 analysis challenged this position not by disputing the carving's Ptolemaic manufacture, but by identifying within its astronomical encoding a precessional signature that does not correspond to stellar positions visible from Egypt in the Ptolemaic period. His calculation, employing astronomical methodology used to date ancient monuments through stellar alignment analysis, identified specific features of the relief's astronomical program more consistent with stellar positions from several centuries before the Ptolemaic period, indicating the sculptors were reproducing an astronomical record whose original observations were made much earlier. The organizational structure of the relief provides the connection to Mesopotamia that this investigation makes necessary to examine with precision. The Mulapin Compendium. The Mesopotamian astronomical reference text dated in its current form to approximately 1,000 years before the Common Era, but drawing on observational traditions traceable to the early 2nd millennium, and almost certainly earlier, divides the visible sky into 3 horizontal bands corresponding to the domains of the 3 primary Anunnaki administrators: the way of Anu in the central band, the way of Enlil in the northern band, and the way of Enki in the southern band. This tripartite celestial division assigns specific constellations and stellar groups to each pathway, and establishes their calendrical and astronomical significance based on their relationship to the administrative domain of the Anunnaki figure associated with that pathway. The Dendera zodiac employs a structurally equivalent tripartite division of the celestial sphere, organizing its astronomical figures into 3 concentric registers that correspond precisely in their stellar content to the 3 ways of the Mulopin system. The specific constellations placed in each register match the Mesopotamian assignments with a consistency that cannot be attributed to independent parallel development. An Egyptian sculptor in Ptolemaic Dendera was reproducing in stone relief on a temple ceiling the 3-pathway celestial division that Sumerian scribes had encoded in the sign system of the Uruk IV corpus and attributed to the 3 primary divine administrators of the heavens. The astronomical framework that organized the night sky into the domains of Anu, Enlil, and Enki was not a Mesopotamian peculiarity. It was a shared organizational system preserved across both civilizations from a source that preceded them both. Cuneiform colophons, the attribution lines that ancient Mesopotamian scribes appended to tablet copies identifying the copyist, the original, and the institutional context of the copy, contain information that has been analyzed primarily for its bibliographic content, but that also preserves a genealogical record of extraordinary interest. Researcher Eleanor Robson of University College London, in her 2008 comprehensive study of Mesopotamian mathematical knowledge, documented that the colophon tradition in mathematical and astronomical texts consistently traces scribal lineages back through named father-son or master-student chains to figures who are identified not as human scholars but as Abgal, the divine sages credited with establishing the scribal arts in the pre-flood period. The colophon of the astronomical text designated BM 40108 in the British Museum collection, for example, traces its transmission chain back through 11 named scribal generations to a figure designated as the human student of Adapa, the first and greatest of the 7 divine sages. These colophons were not literary affectations. They were institutional authentication documents, equivalent to academic citations, whose function was to establish that the content of the tablet derived from an authoritative original source. The scribes who copied astronomical and mathematical texts were claiming, in official institutional documentation, that their knowledge ultimately derived from non-human teachers. Robson's 2008 study, published by Cambridge University Press under the title Mathematics in Ancient Iraq, A Social History, represents the most comprehensive treatment of the social and institutional dimensions of Mesopotamian mathematical knowledge produced in modern scholarship. Her methodology was explicitly sociological. Rather than analyzing the mathematical content of tablets in isolation, she examined the institutional frameworks, scribal schools, temple libraries, royal archives, within which the tablets were produced, and the personnel networks through which mathematical knowledge was transmitted across generations. The pattern Robson identified in the colophons is consistent across a sample spanning several centuries of the Old Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian periods. Technical texts, containing mathematical tables, astronomical calculations, eclipse prediction methods, and related content, show a dramatically higher rate of Abgal attribution in their transmission chains than literary, administrative, or theological texts from the same periods and institutions. The advanced technical knowledge was specifically and consistently identified within the institutional documentation of the scribal system itself, as having originated with the divine sages rather than with human intellectual development. The transmission chain in BM 40108 illustrates the structure. The colophon begins with the copyist's name, a Neo-Assyrian scribe whose name translates as servant of Nabu, followed by his father's name, his grandfather's name, and the institutional affiliation of the family as hereditary scribes of the Nabu temple at Borsippa. It then traces back through 8 further named generations, each identified with the same family lineage and institutional affiliation, to a figure identified only by the epithet "the one who learned from the mouth of Adapa." This final link connects the transmission lineage not to a human founder, but to the first of the 7 divine sages, the primary transmitter of all foundational knowledge from the divine to the human realm in both the Berossus account and the Sumerian cuneiform tradition alike. The scribe who copied this tablet in the Neo-Assyrian period was claiming in his official institutional attribution that the content he was reproducing ultimately derived from Adapa, and through Adapa, from whatever source Adapa received his knowledge. Robson notes with appropriate scholarly caution that these transmission claims cannot be verified, and that the colophon attribution to Abgar lineages may represent a form of institutional prestige claiming. This interpretation is reasonable as far as it goes, but the selective pattern of Abgar attribution, concentrated in technical knowledge and absent or rare in other text categories from the same institutions, argues against pure prestige claiming. If the attribution was simply about asserting ancient authority, it should appear with similar frequency across all text types. Its concentration in technical texts indicates that something about the content of those texts, their mathematical sophistication, their astronomical precision, the range of knowledge they encode, was specifically associated within the scribal tradition's own self-understanding with the divine sages rather than with human intellectual development. The hereditary custodians of that knowledge maintained the association across centuries of institutional transmission, claiming in document after document that what they were copying was not ultimately what their human predecessors had discovered, it was what their non-human predecessors had taught. The oldest writing surface yet recovered documents the beginning of that tradition in its very first marks. When Assyriologist Andrew Lawler published his popular account of early writing origins in Archaeology magazine in 2001, he described the first recoverable written word as a sign for head combined with a sign for food rations, an administrative notation for the disbursement of grain allotments to temple workers. This characterization, while accurate as a description of one early administrative use of cuneiform signs, reflects the interpretive framework applied to the Uruk corpus, rather than a straightforward reading of the earliest recoverable inscription. The Kish tablet in the Ashmolean Museum, the artifact with the strongest claim to being the oldest written document ever found, does not begin with grain. Its first and most deeply incised symbol is a circular form with internal divisions whose closest parallels in the later cuneiform tradition are the signs for sun, divine luminosity, and celestial authority. The first word ever written on the oldest writing surface so far recovered is not an economic notation, it is a celestial designation, and immediately beside it, carved with equal depth and deliberateness, is a form that subsequent layers of the scribal tradition would designate as AN, the sign for the divine heavenly being who the scribes of Uruk and Nippur said had given them their language, their numbers, their calendar, and the symbols they used to record all three. Lawler's characterization is representative of a dominant approach in popular and academic accounts of writing's origins that proceeds by selecting the most interpretable administrative examples from the Uruk IV corpus, the ones whose commodity signs are clear and whose numerical notations are straightforward, and presenting those examples as the paradigm case of earliest writing. This approach is defensible as a means of explaining what writing was used for once it was established. It is not defensible as a method of determining what writing was originally designed to record, because it selects its evidence based on what is most interpretable within the administrative framework and then presents that selection as representative of the whole corpus. The Kish tablet resists this selective treatment precisely because it predates the Uruk IV corpus that provides most of the administrative examples, and because its sign inventory, while small, does not fit comfortably into the administrative paradigm. The four major sign groups on the tablet's obverse face have been interpreted by different researchers as commodity labels, personal name components, ritual notations, and proto-alphabetic signs in various combinations. No consensus has been reached on the body part signs or the geometric notations, but the debates over those elements have consistently deflected attention from the circular form in the upper register, the position of categorical primacy in the tablet's compositional layout, which has not been the subject of sustained independent analysis commensurate with its positional significance. Irving Finkel of the British Museum, in his 2015 reassessment of the Kish tablet material, noted that the circular form's graphic characteristics, specifically the arrangement of its internal radiating divisions, distinguish it from the standard pictographic conventions used in both the Uruk IV corpus and the later cuneiform tradition to represent specific objects. The divisions follow a rotational symmetry that, in Finkel's analysis, most closely resembles representations of solar phenomena, specifically the radiant sun disk that appears in early Mesopotamian iconography as the symbol of divine luminosity, and in Egyptian hieroglyphics as the solar determinative associated with divine celestial authority. Immediately to the right of this solar divine primary symbol, carved with strokes of equal depth and at a scale suggesting parallel compositional importance, appears the second symbol that has consistently attracted less attention than its position warrants. The form of a circular boundary enclosing radiating lines that, in the Uruk IV tradition and all subsequent cuneiform usage, designates An, the divine being of the sky. The Kish tablet presents, in its two most prominently positioned and most deeply incised symbols, a solar divine categorical designation followed immediately by the celestial divine being designation. Whatever this tablet was produced to document, it begins by identifying two things: a being associated with solar or divine luminosity, and the divine heavenly presence whose sign the Uruk IV scribes would place at the highest frequency position in their administrative archives centuries later. The convergence of this with every other line of evidence examined is not coincidental. The position of the An sign on the oldest recoverable writing surface, its frequency in the founding layer of the cuneiform tradition, its removal from the archive of W 17,007, its concealment beneath administrative surface layers in the CT-scanned Uruk IV tablets, the Aduba's dual knowledge protocol maintaining inner and outer faces of the same sign system, the Abgal-Colophon chains tracing technical knowledge to non-human sources. The Ziusudra texts claim that the scribble tradition was a recovery rather than an invention. Every line of evidence converges on a single recognition, and the final, synthesizing question, what it all means, and what the erase symbol beside the first word actually points toward, demands to be examined with the same precision that has been applied to every other element of this record. The erasure documented on Uruk Tablet W 17,007 is not, when examined in the full context of the Mesopotamian evidence assembled here, an isolated act of scribal correction. It is a visible data point in a pattern that spans the entirety of the cuneiform record. The systematic narrowing of a writing tradition that began with 900 signs organized around the primacy of divine celestial designation into an administrative system optimized for the management of grain and livestock. The signs that were lost between Uruk IV and the early dynastic period were not lost randomly. They were, as the frequency and category analyses of Nissen, England, Veldhuis and Sells have collectively demonstrated, the signs most closely associated with non-administrative, non-economic, celestially and divinely oriented content, exactly the content that the earliest tablets indicate was the original priority of the scribal system. The erasure on W 17007 is the material signature of that process. Someone in the administrative offices of the Iana precinct made a decision that a particular divine designation did not belong in the official record. They smoothed it away. But they could not smooth away the ghost impression left in the clay beneath, and they could not smooth away the 900 signs from which the system came, or the scribes who spent their careers copying lists that began with the names of heaven before they reached the names of grain. The first word ever written points upward. The symbol erased beside it points to who was there when it was written. The pattern of systematic narrowing is not something that happened by accident or through the natural processes of institutional development. Natural institutional development produces sign systems that expand their administrative vocabulary while retaining their foundational categorical structure. The developmental trajectory of cuneiform moves in the opposite direction in the specific domain that concerns the oldest and most fundamental content of the scribal tradition. It retains and refines the administrative vocabulary while systematically eliminating the celestial and divine categorical vocabulary that the Uruk IV evidence demonstrates was not a decorative addition to the administrative core, but the organizing framework from which the administrative categories were derived. The scale of what was narrowed becomes clear only when the full Uruk IV sign inventory is examined against the Uruk III and early dynastic inventories, using the category-by-category methodology that Nissen, England, and their colleagues developed. The administrative vocabulary, commodity signs, numerical notations, institutional designations for human personnel and human-managed resources, survives virtually intact from Uruk IV through the Old Babylonian period and beyond, growing more stylized in form but maintaining consistent semantic range. The celestial and divine vocabulary contracts sharply from Uruk IV to Uruk III, contracts further from Uruk III to the early dynastic period, and is then maintained at its reduced level as a grammatical rather than a semantic vocabulary, present as determinatives and title markers, absent as primary categorical designations for the kind of operational activity that the Uruk IV archive shows those signs were originally recording. What remains accessible, preserved in the Aduba's dual knowledge transmission protocol and encoded in the subsurface layers that CT imaging has made visible beneath administrative surface texts, is a consistent tradition of claiming that the cuneiform system's full scope exceeded its administrative application. The HS 1548 passage about the inner face of the signs, the NI 95 tablets sealed in cedar resin chambers beneath the Eker precinct, the colophon chains tracing transmission back through 11 generations to the human student of Adapa, the Ziusudra texts claim that the signs were established in their places and the count of heaven set down in order before the flood. The Mulapin's three-way division of the sky into the administrative domains of Anu, Enlil and Enki, reproduced without modification in the Dendera zodiac carved by Egyptian sculptors 900 kilometers and 3 millennia from the Uruk IV scribes who first pressed the AN sign into the leading position of the inaugural human archive, the institution that produced all of this, the scribal tradition that remembered what the signs originally recorded, that preserved it in sealed chambers and subsurface layers and colophon transmission chains and dual curriculum schools that carried the memory of the celestial divine administrative framework across 3,000 years of civilization, while the official archive maintained only its administrative residue, was doing precisely what the Ziusudra text describes the pre-flood scribal tradition as having done, keeping the signs in their correct positions so that when the recovery came, the knowledge could be found and implemented again. The question the evidence presses upon the investigator is not whether the cuneiform system was more than an administrative notation. That question is answered by the Uruk IV archive itself. 900 signs, organized from divine to mundane, with the Aeon marker in the highest frequency position of the founding layer, deployed in a system whose founding grammar already included categorical determinatives that require prior convention to exist. The question the evidence presses is what that prior convention was. What tradition, operating in the period before 3,200 years before the Common Era, had developed a comprehensive sign system for recording celestial divine administrative activity, trained the first human scribes in its use, and established the dual knowledge transmission protocol that the Adaba would maintain for the next 3,000 years. The Sumerians identified the prior convention clearly and consistently across every category of text in their archive. The Abgul taught it. The Imean coded it. The Ziusudra text preserved the memory that it predated the catastrophe that the Sumerians understood as the dividing line between the world that had been and the world that was rebuilt. And the scribe who pressed the sign for the celestial divine being into the clay of W17007, before covering it with a thin layer of smoothed clay and inscribing a temple allocation record on top, was following institutional protocol. The protocol required that the inner face be concealed beneath the outer face. The inner face recorded who had established the system and what it had originally been for. The outer face recorded the grain. 5,000 years later, the technology that the civilization that inherited the outer face developed has made the inner face visible again, and what it shows, in the ghost impressions and subsurface strokes and partially recoverable forms of the oldest editorial decisions in human history, is a record of something that the first writers considered more important than anything in the temple storerooms, more important than grain, more important than livestock, important enough to press into clay first and carry in the institutional memory of the scribal tradition across 3,000 years of civilization, waiting in the clay beneath the administrative surface of the oldest human archive for the moment when someone would ask not what the first word recorded, but what was written beside it before the smoothing hand came down. The evidence assembled across this investigation points toward a conclusion that conventional accounts of human history have not yet incorporated, though the material from which it derives is housed in the same museum collections, published in the same academic journals, and analysed by the same researchers whose work mainstream archaeology cites as its foundation. The cuneiform writing system did not emerge from the administrative demands of a temple grain economy. It emerged fully formed from an institutional tradition whose founding layer was organized around the documentation of celestial divine administrative operations, and the signs that encoded that founding purpose were systematically narrowed, concealed, and eventually lost to the official archive over the generations immediately following the system's first appearance in the archaeological record. What remains is the residue of that narrowing, ghost impressions in smoothed clay, subsurface layers beneath administrative records, dual curriculum schools transmitting inner and outer knowledge through carefully managed hereditary lineages, sealed underground chambers designed to preserve the most archaic materials through indefinite periods of institutional disruption, and astronomical documents reproduced across 3,000 years of continuous transmission right through to the Ptolemaic temple ceilings of Egypt, all pointing back to the same organizational framework, the same three-pathway celestial division, the same foundational claim that the scribal tradition was not an invention, but a recovery. The Sumerians knew this about themselves. They encoded it in the Emi lists, preserved it in the Ziusudra flood text, authenticated it in the Abgal colophon chains of their most technically sophisticated documents, and taught it as the necessary precondition for understanding what any mark pressed into clay ultimately meant. They had inherited their writing, and the question of who gave it to them is no longer purely theological. It is archaeological, philological, astronomical, and mathematical simultaneously, and every domain of evidence points in the same direction. The paradigm shift this evidence demands is not a minor adjustment to the standard timeline. It requires a fundamental reconsideration of what human civilization is, how far back its sophisticated phases extend, and what relationship the literate cultures of the historical period bear to the knowledge systems that preceded them. The scribal tradition that pressed the AN sign into the highest frequency position of the founding archive, and then spent 3,000 years maintaining the inner face of that sign system in parallel with its official administrative reduction, was not preserving superstition. It was preserving a record of operations transmitted through the only institutional mechanism robust enough to survive civilizational catastrophe, the living chain of teacher to student, inner knowledge to worthy recipient, sealed chamber to future excavator. We are now, for the first time, in possession of imaging technologies capable of reading what was written beneath the surface of the oldest human documents. The clay has been waiting 5,000 years. The ghost impressions are still there. And what they show, in the subsurface layers beneath the grain tallies, in the smooth depression of W17007, in the highest frequency position of the 900 sign system that appeared at the dawn of human writing without a childhood, is that the first thing humanity committed to permanent record was not a transaction. It was a name, and the name belonged to something that came from the sky.